4 years ago, I distanced myself from the UFO community and my contemporaries, and I said to them, unless you can bring the people alternatives, unless you can bring them the truth, unless you can inject into all this harem, scarum, gloom, doom stuff a note of spirituality and hope, I'll have nothing to do with it. So I made my stand 4 years ago and distanced myself from them. I'm the only one, as far as I know, throughout the world who talks about the spiritual aspects of ufology. And indeed, the bottom line is that UFOs are spiritual in nature. They are not what we think in terms of hardware and extraterrestrials who are cloned, and some of them are, and the people from, let's say, the reticuli and so forth, the little gray men and all this. These things are true. But when you look at it from a higher point of consciousness and view, you will find out that indeed it is a spiritual experience. Each time you look at a UFO, you're looking at a part of you. How's that set with you? You're looking at a part of you. You're looking at a part of your consciousness which has always been there and is manifesting in a way that, number one, it gets your attention. Number two, it hits you deep within spiritually, and you have a realization that I was once there. Now, what's happening at this time, and don't get discouraged now, because I will get into the harem scarum later on, but I want to preface it all with the spiritual denotation so that you have a better understanding later on of what the whole thing is about. Some years ago, 1980, I was lecturing before 800 some odd people in Oakland Auditorium, Oakland, California. And we had 4 days. It was called UFO Symposium 1980. And I was one of the feature speakers. Wendell Stevens, Colonel Wendell Stevens, myself, were the two principal speakers. At the end of the conference, we had a question and answer period. And I'll never forget the little lady's name. Her name was Clarion. And she had such a clear, resonant, Tinkerbell type of voice. I mean, when she spoke, she was distinct from anybody else. She was real joy. And she was a little lady, and she dressed in a sort of a dowdy way and what have you, but you could never doubt that she was a special being. So she says, I have a question for Virgil. She called me Posty in those days. And she said, can you give us a succinct statement regarding UFOs as to their true reality? Well, as often happens to me when I'm up before a large crowd and lecturing and what have you, things come out of my mouth which I least expect. And they're out there, and I said, who said that? You know, what caused me to say that? So these profound things come through me, and sometimes I have to pretend that I'm doing it with great wisdom when I'm not at all. It's coming through me, you see. So at that moment, what came out of my mouth really surprised me. Without hesitation, I said to her, indeed I can. I can give you a succinct statement as to what UFOs are really about. And I said at that point in time, I said, it is a point in time of consciousness, yours and mine. I want you to take that home with you and think about it. It is a point in time of consciousness, yours and mine, and we could say theirs. It's always been there. It will always be there. It is nothing new. If you go back into biblical research, you will find no less than 12 noted prophets and speakers or beings in the Bible who had UFO experiences. They may have called it by a different name. In other words, chariots of fire, you know, wheels within wheels, and columns of fire and so forth. They had references to it, but the reference to that was in the framework of their thinking and state-of-the-art of the technology at that time. It wasn't too long ago, for instance, right here in this country, before we began to see these sleek spherical objects that we now call UFOs, that our forefathers, going back to your great-grandparents and beyond, were seeing sailing craft, the old master schooners, actually flying through the heavens, you see, going from one horizon to the other. And they viewed them, of course, as sailing craft as opposed to these sleek objects we see today. Now, there's a learning lesson in this that you see. And that is, as technology, of course, becomes greater, and as our awareness becomes greater, and we are oriented towards technology, then, of course, the object that we're going to see of that same energy we're talking about is going to be technologically oriented towards our current thinking and state-of-the-art technology. So this is why we see UFOs in the form that we do today, you see. It's the same old energy. It's always been there. But we are viewing it, of course, in the perceptive, if you will, or perception of what we think is real. But it's the same energy. Now, like our energy, yours or mine or anybody in the room, there is so-called good or bad. And you notice I said so-called because there is no such thing as good or bad. There only is. It's the judgments that we have that make it what it is, you see. And so even when we deal with UFOs, we have to categorize them into the two categories of good or bad. And there is the third category where we could say indifferent, because there are those amongst us who, of course, are, and I'm talking extraterrestrially, who are indifferent or they are amoral. They have no feelings for you and I whatsoever. They look very much like we do, but they indeed would squash you like a bug if they had to, because the only thing they're concerned about is themselves and what it is that they need at this time. Which brings up another very important point, and that is, since the planet is in the process of graduating, and indeed we are, we're graduating this time around from the third dimension into the fourth and fifth. Now, this is unique because in the normal progression of things, you always move from one level of consciousness to the other progressively. This time, though, we as a planet, we as a peoples, and we as a consciousness are making a quantum leap into the future, and we're going simultaneously into the fourth and fifth dimension. Now, there's a reason for that, and it's basically could be referred to as catch-up, because we are a laggard planet. At least we have been in the past. But now we have turned out to be one of the most important planets in the whole scheme of God or the Creator's things. We have become unique because we have ended up being the toughest learning school there is in the whole universe. There's none other tougher than planet Earth. And if you come down here and do your job successfully, you are guaranteed when you go back over there of great things. The truth is that each and every one of you sitting here today is a God, and you don't know it. Jesus told us 2,000 years ago, he warned us, and he told us in a very gentle way through an admonition which he rendered to the Pharisees. He said, "Know ye not that ye are gods?" Now the reason he said that is the Pharisees were hassling him about saying he and the Father were one. And he would say, "The Father and I are one." What he was telling them at that point was that he was God personified in body to come down here to experience that which he had created. There's a book back there called The 12 Women Apostles, and I spell that out in that book in a very gentle way so that it is not totally offensive to fundamentalist religion and what have you. But nonetheless, when you read the prophetic statements in there, you'll see indeed to what he was referring to, that he was God, the Creator, down here in a personified body to experience that which he, of course, had created. And the Pharisees were consistently taking him to task, and finally one day they said, "How dare you say that you and the Father are one?" And this is when he turned on them, finally in exasperation, and said, "For God's sake, go read your books, for in your books it says, 'Know ye not that ye are gods.'" So the truth is, if you were to be in my full array of my presentation, this is one of the things that I make very clear, is that each and every one of us are gods in amnesia. You know, there's a long, long story that goes with it, and I'll probably get into it later on, but we've been genetically altered, and we have been, shall we say, what's the proper word for it? Anyhow, we have been genetically altered and seduced, I guess is a good word for it, into believing that we are what we are when indeed we are not. Now, to go back to what I said about the graduation and jumping from one dimension to the other, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Believe it or not, within our solar system, there are 12 planets, not the customary 9 that the astrologers use and so forth. There are 3 additional planets above the 9 and above the moon and the sun. And of the 12, Earth is one. All other planets, the 11 other planets, have reached the point of ascendancy wherein they are ready to move out of the 3rd dimension into the 4th dimension. And the one that is not quite ready yet, of course, is our little planet called planet Earth. So this is why we are experiencing all the things that we are at this point in time in terms of duress and stress and wars and fratricide and all the things, of course, which are predominant throughout the world today. We are going through a cleansing process in order to be able to ascend and join the sisterhood and the brotherhood of planets who await us. Our solar system cannot graduate from the 3rd into the 4th dimension until such time planet Earth, that little planet here, joins the sisters and brothers. And then at that point, of course, we are ready to move with the rest into the 4th and 5th dimension. Now, that's happening to you right now. Now, this is another reason why you have such frequency and intensity of UFO sightings today. This is another reason why you are so aware and keen and interested in that subject called ufology. But however, unless it's looked at spiritually as I'm giving you today, that was the insight that I'm giving you today, it cannot be anything but frightening and derogatory in nature and cause you to become imbalanced. So this is why I always introduce more or less the overall picture first to give you some idea that these things are a part and parcel of you, that they've always been there, they always will be, and you are taking unto yourself what you perceive. Now, all of this, and I'd like to now branch into another aspect of this, which I think is quite interesting. I have many books which are long out of date. You might get them. Here's one called Secrets of UFOs. This was put out by Don Elkins back in the 70s, and they are some of the most profound writings that's ever been rendered on the subject of ufology. Don and others, of course, dealt with what we would call today abductees, only they refer to them as contactees. And there are many, many more contactees than there are abductees, you say. And these contactees are spiritual in nature. These are spiritual experiences vis-a-vis the horrendous things that we read about in Whitley Strieber's books and things of this nature. The one common characteristic throughout all of these books, and incidentally all of the dialogue in here and the examples of the people who were under hypnosis who related what they were experiencing at the time, each and every one of them always brought in the spirituality of their UFO experience. Without exception, each one said that they were previously introduced here on Earth from a UFO, an unidentified flying object, an extraterrestrial craft. Their memories, when they relate under hypnosis where they came from and how they got here, the likeness is startling. They come from a different planet. Their primary mode of transportation is, of course, in a spacecraft. And when they were introduced here into Earth, up to a degree, a certain level of consciousness, they were in a UFO to get here. They give full recall and recollection of actually parting from their, say, their comrades on that particular planet they're in, going into a spacecraft first, bidding adieu to their friends, knowing full well that the veil is going to be pulled, their consciousness will be cut off, that is the previous consciousness of their planet, and that they will be introduced into Earth in this very basic form we call humanness. From the point that they leave their point of origin to the time just before they're introduced into Earth, which would be, we would probably refer to as the astral plane, the upper astral, they are in that life-supporting ship and that life-supporting mode. It's at that point, alone and in conjunction with other things, that they go through the metamorphosis of getting ready to come in here into Earth, you see. There's a transformational process that takes place at that time in order to allow them to come into a human body and come into the third dimension. Many of them are just like, it's like jumping from an airplane. Many people are scared to death. And many of them are too. They have reservations about it coming down here and experiencing it. And each and every one of you did too, probably. All of us, Because we know beforehand what to expect before we get here. Now the grace is that when we finally reach this point of realization and we have lowered our vibrations enough, and that's exactly what it's all about, lowering our vibrations enough to come into the third dimension, at that time all previous memory is wiped out. And we forget who we were, our greatness, and all the other things, of course, that we were so accustomed to. Now, the other thing is that, and this is provocative, and I am going to give it to you, though. I give many, many spiritual counselings and readings, of course, in Europe. And one of my primary functions over there, after I do my lectures and workshops and on weekends, during the week I read for people. And in my readings, many times the question is asked, well, how do we get here? First of all, I relate to them that we do get here, believe it or not, by an extraterrestrial craft that's associated with our home planet. The other thing is that in that transformational process, and now I'd have to use the women per se in this explanation, there are some things which we don't commonly relate to or talk about. Let's talk about pregnancy. And believe it or not, it's tied in with ufology, pregnancy. What happens is you are on the inner planes, and let's just lump that into that statement, inner planes. And what you do, you're still in a state of consciousness, of awareness, should I say. You know who you are. You know what you must do. And so what you do, you look down on Earth, and you need a vehicle through which to be introduced here on Earth in order to be human, in order to do the job which you were destined to do down here. Okay, so after you've been counseled by the elders on the inner planes to receive approval, and that's a very important point right there. There isn't anybody here this time that is here by accident. Each and every one of you have been handpicked to be here at this time. I don't care who you are, whether it's Hitler or murderer or rapist or what have you. You indeed have been hand-selected and picked to play the role that you're playing right now. There are no mistakes this time around because, as I said, we're in the process of graduating from the third into the fourth and fifth dimension, making that quantum leap, if you will. Now, before you can come in this time, however, unlike before, because you could blip in and out anytime you wanted to, this time around you have had to receive approval from the elders. So what they do, they take a look at your past life track record, so to speak. In other words, your pluses and your minuses. And then they decide whether or not you are a worthy subject to be sent in here to do what has to be done for the planet and for yourself. Many of us are here because we have karma to attend to. And this is our last opportunity to set that karma right, you see. So all of this is discussed with you prior to coming in conjunction with the elders. At such time that you convince them that you are worthy to come in here, they say, all right, now your next step. Now at that point, incidentally, they assign you your inner plane's name. And your inner plane's name is always your first and middle name. That part is given to you if you have a middle name. That part is given to you on the inner planes. After you've got that, you basically have either 1/2 or 2/3 of the requirements which you need to complete your journey here on Earth. Then you're instructed to seek a set of parents who can fill out the rest, flesh out the rest of what you need for your journey here on Earth, to follow the roadmap which you will create. At that point, you look down on Earth and you say, yeah, no, I don't know if they'll do or not, yeah. And pretty soon, you hit upon a set of parents that fill the requisites and the prerequisites of what you need to complete that name. Now, let's take someone like me. I lecture under the name of Virgil Armstrong, and I'm known all over the world as Virgil Armstrong. But I have a very British name, and believe it or not, it's a toughie. and it's Postlethwaite. Who would hang a handle on anybody like that unless it was necessary? That's my last name. Along with Virgil Armstrong Postlethwaite. I chose the Postlethwaite family because they were most suitable for what I had to do here on earth. And as it turns out, numerologically, with the name Postlethwaite, Virgil Armstrong, I had a complete chart. In other words, I had no karma. But don't let that kid you. That makes it tougher to be here than if you had karma in reality. So now, what I did to follow this through, so you better understand what I'm saying. You're still in the spacecraft mode. You're still in the spacecraft or extraterrestrial consciousness is what I'm saying. And now we're at a point where I have to choose my parents, and I did choose the Postlethwaites. Now, at that time, I had to convince them to have me. So what I did, while I was still in the etheric body, I went to them, and I whispered in my mother's ear telepathically, "You need a baby." You know, and that's exactly what we do. We go down, and we're still in that etheric electromagnetic body rather than the physical body, and we whisper in Mommy's ear, "You need a baby." So Mommy thinks about it for a while, and the next thing you know, she talks to her husband, and of course there's an agreement, a contract made between the two, and there is the initial beginning of you. Of course, it happens in other ways, rambunctiously. It could be rape, or it could be the spur of the moment, or whatever, but nonetheless, at all times, it's by design. There are no accidents, you see. But the normal way, the way I'm about to give you, is the way that most of us get in here. So we convince Mommy to convince Father to have the baby, and what happens? Father plants seed in Mother, and it's microscopic in size. You can't even see it with the naked eye. But then it begins to grow, and when it does, it gets larger, 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 and finally, somewhere around the 4th month of pregnancy, we have, of course, a remarkable thing happening. So we have the 4th, 5th, and we have the normal 9 months of pregnancy, in other words, full-term pregnancy. But what the medical people are not telling you is that we're not in the womb until somewhere around the 4th month. What's in there up to that point in a developmental state is a little body that has basically an animal intelligence. It has no real consciousness, what have you. It's in a developmental stage. Now, during these 4 months, we are still in the etheric, we're still on the inner planes, and concurrently with development within the mother's womb, we're out there doing other things, you see. Becomes the 4th month, it's time to lock in, and this is the point that we lose all consciousness of where we came from and who we are. Because at that point, we leave the ship, we go into the body of our mother, and now we are there for full-term pregnancy. That was for an additional 5 months. Now, just as an aside, and I'll end this real quickly, during these 5 months that we're actually in the womb, this is when we program our mothers and our fathers to call us by the name that we have today. Because that name is essential in order to complete your journey here on earth. When you're in, what is your name, dear, your first name? Doris. Right. While Doris was in her mother's womb, she says to her father and she says to her mother telepathically, particularly to her mother while she's in the womb, "When I am born, you will call me Doris." It isn't, "Oh, Mommy, would you please call me Doris?" No, no. You will call me Doris, you see. So she gets that. She's bombarded by it for 5 months. The other thing is that when mother and father are sleeping together, you go and you touch his aura, you get into his consciousness, and you tell him the same thing. "Look, Buster, when I'm born, you're going to call me Doris." So they are pre-programmed for this right up to the point that you, of course, come out of the womb, and you're Christian by what you call your Christian name or your baptismal name, you see, or may happen to be. All of this, again, is coming from a spiritual point of view and is of an extraterrestrial nature. So it's just a little aside I'd like to throw in there to clear up some other things that may be of interest to you here on earth. Number one, as I said, there are no accidents here on earth. Everything is by design. Everything is by decree. The rapist, the murderer, and everybody else is a prime ingredient of the cosmic pie, so to speak. I got in trouble in Germany before an audience of 1,500 and some odd. I was lecturing, and I said that Hitler was a divine instrument. My God, you could hear the audible gasp. 1,500 people simultaneously gasping is really notable. And so I just stood up there and let it sink in, and then all of a sudden I could, over here to my left was a little man, an older man, I guess he was in his 60s, and he stood up and he said, "Jawohl!" And he gave a salute, Hitler salute. And every head, mostly women in there, swung towards him, and the poor guy was skunked. He had to get out of there, and he left. I never saw him again. After that, I explained to them that Hitler was the last of the lords of darkness. Because when I teach the Mayan prophecy and the Mayan calendar, there were 9 lords of darkness. And the last lord of darkness began in 1935, and he ended in 1987. And the one who played that role was none other than one we knew as Hitler. And I'll be talking about his involvement with the extraterrestrials later on, because he had a deep involvement with the same ones we're working with right now. All of that prior to, of course, our involvement with the Greys. He was the first one to work with the Greys on an aware level, so to speak. Okay. So Hitler then was the last Lord of Darkness, and incidentally, he didn't die in the bunker. He was taken to Argentina. Again, I'll talk about it later on. He lived out a full life down there. He died in his 90s. Now, I didn't know this until I had finished that very same lecture in Frankfurt, Germany. I had another lecture in Chicago, back-to-back with it. So as soon as I finished that lecture, I had to hop on a plane, fly to Chicago, and give my presentation there. And in my audience was a little lady who was so excited when I was giving information about Hitler and the Greys and so forth. So after the whole thing was over with, she came up to me and says, "Virgil, I must talk to you. I have very important information for you, which substantiates what you've already said." And I said, "Well, now I was booked solid in readings all that week." And I said, "Unless I have a cancellation, say in the evening around dinner time, I won't be able to talk to you until the whole thing is over. But if I have a cancellation, I indeed will call you, and we can have dinner together, and then you can convey to me what it is you want me to know." Well, sure enough, I think about the 4th day of my readings, I had a cancellation, and I called her. And her background and origin was Argentinian. And she said to me, "I am the daughter of the former Secret Service head of all of Argentina." And her name is, how do you pronounce it? Rubio Monteiro. And she said when she was about, somewhere between 12 and 13, she and her father were sitting in an outdoor cafe in Argentina, Buenos Aires. And he said to her, he said, "See that man sitting over there?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "Well, he's a very famous man." And she said, "Well, who is he, Daddy?" "Well, his name was Hitler." "And you see the woman sitting next to him?" "Yes." "Well, that's his wife, Eva Braun." And so now, this is long after the war is over, you see. And this is back in I guess, the 70s, really. Late 60s, early 70s. And it was at least that. So anyhow, the point is that Hitler did not die. He played his role as the last Lord of Darkness. He then, of course, was surreptitiously taken by submarine, and there's much more to the story than this, surreptitiously taken by submarine into Argentina, and there he lived out his life in full. And Eva Braun, the last I heard, she was in her 80s, and I heard just recently she has also died. He died in his 90s. So he fulfilled the prophecy of the Mayan calendar and the Mayan prophecy. Now there again, I use that illustratively to point out to you that there isn't anybody here that's not here for a specific reason or some type of design. There's only one exception to that extraterrestrially, and that is because we are in the process of graduating from the 3rd into the 4th and 5th, And these are the most trying, testing times we will ever experience. They have turned loose upon us the lower astral. And all you have to do today is look around the world, and you can see this representatively in other countries. For instance, what's happening in Yugoslavia right now. Look what brother is doing to brother. I mean, it's sheer insanity. Look in, say, your own country right here, and look within your own city, Phoenix, Arizona, or any of the larger cities, and look at the things that happen that are amoral in nature. In other words, people indiscriminately killing children and adults and what have you, and there's no basic reason for it other than they just kill, you know. There's not even hate many times involved. It's an indiscriminate type of thing that takes place that, in a sense, is a mark of insanity. Yes, question?
I have a question. You mentioned the planets.
Mm-hmm.
How does astrology fit into that? Is like the planet we last came from? You know, I don't know how.
Well, what I say in terms of, in answer to your question, I say that astrology basically is playing with a half a deck, you know, because there are 3 other major planets that they're not considering, you see. And so we do not have a in-depth and true interpretation of who we really are.
So not all of us may come from the same planet.
Oh, no,
Before we
no.
here on the ship or
Yeah.
however we decided.
Right.
And the vibration of the planet also determines.
Well, the vibration of the original planet, of course, is lost when you come in here. You may have memories of it and recall, particularly in your meditation, particularly sometimes in your periods of reflection. You may say to yourself, as I think most of the people have done at one time or another, I don't belong here. I don't feel like I belong here. I know I'm here to do something, but that's not really where I truly belong. I belong out there someplace. Even many times when we look at the heavens, we have an awareness, you know, that we belong elsewhere, or we came from some other place. Now, the Indians are much more open to this than we are. For instance, if you go up here to the Hopis and talk to the Hopi Indians, and if you ask them, you're on the inner circle, and say, where do you truly come from? They might give you an answer like, we come from the inner earth, or we might do this or that. But if they feel that you're worthy of it, they will point to the Pleiades and say, we come from there, the 7 sisters, you see. So they come from the Pleiades. If you go to the Dogons in Africa, the blue-black race, and you ask them where they come from, they will say, we come from there. Serious. And so every tribe, for instance, the Aborigines in Australia, are very advanced spiritual peoples. You know, they're like our Indians. They're regarded as savages. They're regarded as, in many cases, barbarians and drunks and all this. They're not. As you will hear tomorrow when I talk about the Indians and the Aboriginal peoples, they're you might say, the arcane, they keep the arcane secrets in hiding. They are the spiritual leaders of the future. And they are the eldest of brothers. They have a greater understanding who we really are and where we come from than we do, you see. Yet we treat them, as I say, like barbarians. There's another very important distinction, which you will hear tomorrow when I lecture on the Indians. There's such a thing as the Indians in the making and the true Indians. And there is a diversity here, you see. And what you're seeing on the reservation, for the most part, are the Indians in the making. The drugs, the alcohol, the prostitution, the black magic, and all these things, these are Indians who have previously been white people or some other race who has abused the Indians, the conquistadors, the cavalrymen, and people like this. And they basically and inordinately mistreated the Indian. They've come back this time in their last lifetime to pay the karma for what they did to those people. And now they're in red bodies or Indian bodies, and of course, as one of my Indian friends said to me, they ain't doing so well, are they? But with another thing too, within every tribe that I've ever visited, whether it be here in the Americas or Mexico or Central America, wherever I go, I find that in the inner core there's a very pristine and pure group. And this is the group you must always reach if you are to work with them. You can't find them. They'll reach out and get you if they think you're worthy of it, and they'll bring you into the inner circle, and there's where you learn the truth about the things that I'm telling you right now, and you will hear tomorrow about the Indians. It's mind-boggling. Okay, So let me sum this introductory part up simply with this. All UFO experiences are spiritual in nature. Please bear that in mind, because it is. It's an experiencing of your individualistic and your collective consciousness. It's always been there, it always will be. I'd like to use an illustration biblically oriented to give you some idea of what I'm talking about. We all know of the great exodus that took place in Egypt with Moses and Aaron and, of course, all the people who followed them. We know that they spent 40 years in the desert, roaming, it seemed almost indiscriminately. But they also had some great experiences. Some of them, of course, are legendary, and they are recorded in the Bible or other books associated, such as the Lost Scrolls of the Dead Seas. These are chronicles that speak in truth rather than the hidden way that the Bible speaks. For instance, we know the epic story about Moses and the Red Sea. Do you think for a moment that he raised a staff and said, "God, please part that sea for me"? He didn't. There was UFO that was with them all the time. They were in that desert hovering over them, supplying their needs. And when he was being pursued by the Pharaoh's men, he took what is known as a vril rod, V-R-I-L, vril, it's a power rod, which was directly in concert with the ship that was hovering above him. And he was told to point the vril rod at the sea, and they would do the rest. And indeed they did. History speaks for itself. He parted the seas, seemingly. He and his people, of course, made it across. And then, of course, as soon as they got across, the power was cut off. The seas closed in, and there went the Pharaoh's men. There's another story about him. He was out of water. And again, he took the vril rod, and he was told to go over to a certain rock and tap it 3 times, and he'd have water. Well, he did, and a gush and a fountain came up, and they had inordinate amounts of water, to suit all their needs, to carry them for the rest of their journey. We talk about, example, you ever hear of manna? Manna from heaven? Okay, what do you think that was? That was created during the time of Moses. That came from the ship. The Jews at that time were sick and tired of their rice and bean diet, and they were always complaining. And so Moses went to the mentor, the ship, whether it be Jehovah or whoever it was, I don't know. And he said, "Look, my people are restless. They need a change in diet and so forth. Can you do something for me?" And they said to him, "Have your women at the break of dawn tomorrow, while the dew is still in the bushes, go out, and the food that you're looking for will be there." Well, that was the manna. The manna was festooned on the bushes. It hung down like, you can liken it to cotton candy. When you go to a carnival, you ever eat cotton candy? That was the consistency of it. And it had all the vitamins, and it had a luscious taste and everything else, and they were real happy. And the women would go out while the dew was still on the plants and so forth, and collect it in their baskets and take it back, and that was their regiment and diet, of course, for the day. All of these things, of course, are related extraterrestrially. If you think for a moment that the one known as Jonah went in the belly of a whale, a stinking whale, for 3 days, and then came out whole and live, that's a bunch of hooey. He went into the belly of an aquatic UFO, and received the instructions that he was supposed to have, and then came back and became a great prophet. So there's many, many references in the Bible, of course, to, again, the spiritual experiences of ufology. So I just want to throw that out today to get you to thinking about the spiritual aspects. The other thing is, many people, and I came down on several people years and years ago. I've been in this business so long. There was a woman who wrote a book that said simply that when the time comes that each and every one of us will be lifted off by the spacecraft from the planet and be spared the adversities of the coming Earth changes. And incidentally, I'm getting ready to cut a tape on the coming Earth changes, what you can expect physically and spiritually in the relative near future. We've only got 7 years between the year now and the year 2000 when all of this will have to be said and done. So I think it's wise that people know what they can expect, what their alternatives are, and what will take place in terms basically of the physical and the planet itself. Now tomorrow in my Indian presentation I will be talking about that in a degree, because I'll be talking about the Mayan prophecy, I'll be talking about the Hopi prophecy, and then I will be talking about the ultimate Indian prophecy. And it's in these sequences that we get some awareness and some idea of what's going to happen to us in the very near future. You know, we're coming down the finish line right now. We're running for all we're worth. We're headed for the tape, you know, to finish the race. But before we get there, we still got some very important things to do. And to many of us, they will be pleasant. To others, they're going to be horrendous. Depends upon where you are with your state of consciousness. If you're capable at this time of accommodating incoming spirit or the Christ consciousness, you will be spared the majority, if not all, of the adversities that others will experience. There is no safe place in the physical. If that's where your mind is, you're doomed to experience the very things that you are fearing. Fear is one of the greatest elements of control that the bad extraterrestrials have over us. As long as you fear, you give your power away. If you can be one with the source or God, the creator, or one with the Christ, you will be spared these adversities. Even if you were to be harmed momentarily, for the moment, you would not feel great pain and what have you. You'd be taken out of body into your rightful place and in concert with the Christ. So if you can remember all that, then of course that's the survival that you're looking for in terms of the coming earth changes. Earth changes are a certainty. And I think the most apropos statement that Jesus ever made in terms of something like this, he said in answer to a question, when can we expect you to come? He said, I shall come like a thief in the night. Which means literally that he will come when we least expect it. Now the truth is, he's already here. And of course, it is in the form of consciousness. You know, we're not going to have, the only ones that are going to see the Christ in the second coming are those who are on a like vibration and like consciousness. For those who are not, they're not going to see him. But those of you who can raise your consciousness high enough to accommodate the Christ consciousness, you indeed will see the second coming of the Christ. So what Tuella said about everybody being lifted off the planet, you know, in the time of great disaster is not true. The space vehicle that will take you off of this planet as the extraterrestrial that you truly are, and incidentally, planet Earth is a spacecraft, you know. It's hurtling through space just like any other spacecraft could or would, and you are part and parcel of it. But the vehicle to get you off of this planet into your respective places from which you came, your point of origin and so forth, into the fourth and fifth dimension, believe it or not, is that body you sit in right here. There's a transformational process that's taking place and has been for many years now in the body, in the consciousness, in the soul, and in the mind. Each and every one of us, if we are doing our job right, we are going through a transformational process wherein we are becoming light. We are donning our light bodies as opposed to what we normally had before, which was a body of corporeality. The Bible, even the Bible states it almost unequivocally. It says, dust to dust, earth to earth. That's the old archaic thinking. That's all changed now. You've changed it. You've changed it through your actions and your interactions. You have changed it through your consciousness, and now what we're doing, you as an individual and me, we're lifting ourselves into the light, because the light is the escape mechanism that we will use to get off of this planet. In the past, there have been several things they have used, several vehicles. Again, we're talking about the extraterrestrials. They have used several vehicles to raise the consciousness, not only of the planet, but also of you and I. And again, this is an aside. I won't go into it in depth. It is part of another lecture that I give. But the instruments which they have used in the past are, of course, pyramids, crystals, vortexes, and you and I. Now, I'm not an artist, but crystals, better put a cap on that, I guess. Crystals, pyramids, vortexes. The ultimate, of course, is you and I. There are 12 of these. There's 12 of these, and there's unlimited amounts of vortexes. Throughout the earth as we know it, and I'll be writing this in my next book. I've been commissioned in Germany to write my second book, in addition to the one I have back there. That's the Armstrong Report number 2. They've asked me to write Armstrong Report number 1, I beg your pardon. And now I've been commissioned to write Armstrong Report number 2. I'm going to be talking about these things in the Armstrong Report number 2. Around the planet, you're following the equatorial belt, such as you see here. This is our planet. You've got juxtapositioned all around the planet. You have crystals, and you have, of course, pyramids. All of these are strategically located in the proximity, either south or north, of the equatorial belt, as you see it here. And these are instruments, these two right here, basically, are primary instruments of control to influence you and I to respond to a given incoming vibration or consciousness. Now, the one thing that the guardian forces, and for the most part I'm talking about the guardian forces, the one thing they will not do, vis-a-vis, say, the not-so-good ETs, is to interfere with free will of mine. They will not. That is sacred, even to them, and they know that it's sacred to us. So therefore, they will not interfere with our free will, but they will interact with us subliminally by using these divine instruments, the pyramids and the crystals, the vortexes, to cause you and I to respond in a given way. Let's say that what they wish to do is to raise the consciousness of the planet. Well, the planet resonates at 7.83 roughly hertz. So what they would like then is for each and every one of us to respond to that 7.83 hertz, you see, so that we become, how should we say, in harmony, you know, and we are sympathetic to the incoming vibrations. So that's a subliminal influence that they impose upon us. Now, to cause all this to come to pass, they use the crystals and, of course, the pyramids around the equatorial belt by beaming energy into these edifices, such as the pyramid and the crystal, to get them to vibrate to a given harmonic or frequency. Many years ago, while working with the Pueblo Indians in Taos, New Mexico, looking for my teacher, and I finally found him. He was an Indian with the Pueblo Club, the name of, tribe, I should say, called Sunhawk. And my Indian training, of course, came through him, and he's now dead. But during that time, too, I was very much into the study, particularly the spiritual aspects of UFOs, when this information was given to me. Had to do with the many sonic booms that were taking place back in those days. How many people remember the sonic booms back? Okay. They said it was the new Concorde, the new French aircraft. They said it was the military developing new craft and what have you. I didn't believe it. So I went to the brothers, the Space Brothers, and my ship particularly, and I said, look, are they doing it or is it you? And they said, we're doing it. And I said, well, what the hell are you doing? They said, well, we're adjusting the planet, you know, with the coming Earth changes and the things which are going to be taking place in the near future, there has to be some adjustments. So we're taking some things in and we're taking other things out. And this activity, of course, is causing these sonic booms. Well, I'm from Missouri. So, you know, and I'm a very pragmatic man, really. Being ex-military and everything that I am, I have a very pragmatic side. But I also have a side which I feel is basically creditable, that I can delve into other areas of understanding. So my first question then was, well, okay, maybe that's so. How about showing me what you're doing? The next thing you know, and I was in meditation at that point, I was taken out of body, and I ended up, believe it or not, under the Bermuda Triangle. And when I got down there, here I am standing here before a huge crystal called the Mother Crystal, which was surrounded by 12 smaller crystals of different shapes and sizes, hexagonal, diamond, all geometric formations, along with the Mother Crystal, which was immense. There's not enough people in this room to get their arms around the circumference of this circle. I mean, this crystal, it was so big. And another thing I noted while I was looking at that, before I asked him what it was all for, I looked down here to my far left, and way down there, about 20 UFOs parked like they were in a parking lot, you know. And immediately in front of them was this huge tunnel that looked like a railroad tunnel. And this was of great interest to me. But anyhow, got my attention back to the crystal, and I said, well, what is this? What's it mean? And then the thought occurred to me, is this the one that sank Atlantis? And they said, yes, that's the one that sank Atlantis. And I said, all right. I said, what does it do? Well, then they began to explain to me the theory that I'm just now giving you, that there are 12 major crystals and there are 12 major pyramids around in a circumference around the equatorial belt. And then they told me how they begin to use these crystals and pyramids and vortexes to stimulate the consciousness of the planet collectively and individualistically. Now, for instance, let's say that this is the crystal itself. I'll use it simultaneously. The ship's up here. And what they do, they beam energy into the crystal itself. And the crystal then takes this energy and it begins to vibrate at a given frequency or harmonic. Now, that's controlled, of course, from the ship in the form of a laser penetration. And as it begins to vibrate, of course, it sings, and it reaches a certain state of resonance. And, of course, what they do then is to farm that out into the other crystals, of course, that surround it. And it's like playing an organ or a piano, you know. They can vary this through the mother crystal itself. They can feed it out into the subcrystals, 12 in nature, and they can have, you know. What's it remind you of? Remember the movie? Yeah. Hey, those guys knew what they were doing when they did it. You know, they were telling us something. And this was the same principle that they described to me as a methodology of influencing you and I and the planet and the world to respond to a given frequency or harmonic. But we have to respond to it. They will not make us do it because they will not interfere with our free will. Incidentally, for your edification, I have plotted all these. I have them now plotted around the equatorial belt, and as I say in my next book, I will reveal where they are. Of interest, 5 of them, 5 of these major pyramids, would you believe it or not, is in the holdings of the United States. Hawaii, beginning with Hawaii. There's one in Maui. There's one off of the coast of Vancouver, which is a contingent part of the USA, and it's under the water. The next one is in the Four Corners area, right where we're living. There's a major pyramid up there. Some years ago it almost came up. I was in on that. And then the next one you will find in the, that's 3. The 4th one is to be found in the, what they call the triangular area of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. You know where that is? That's the old Algonquin area. And that's where all the serpentine mounds are and what have you. And many, many inexplicable things. They're still scratching their head trying to figure out, you know, what they are. And lo and behold, here very recently, just while I was in Europe, they discovered a major pyramid there. They were excavating with bulldozers and they ran into this silly thing, and it's under the ground. And the estimate is that it's something like 1,200 feet deep, something like that is a report I heard. So there's the 5th one. And is that the 4th? Let's see. 1, 2, 3. It's the 4th. The 5th one is to be found off of the coast of Maine, and it's underwater. So there are your 5 of the 7 pyramids, and the rest of them, of course, I have plotted through Europe. And there's some major things in Australia and also New Zealand, particularly when it comes to the crystals. They're there. And for your edification, too, Australia and New Zealand are parts of old Lemuria. You know, it goes way back to a place called Rutos. Before it was Lemuria, it was Rutos. And then later on, of course, became what we know today as Lemuria. The West Coast also, back as far inland as where we are right now, is also part of old Lemuria in its original state. So most of us here, for the most part, who live here, I guess we could say we're old Lemurians, you know. Now, some of us, of course, have had dual lives, both in Atlantis and Lemuria. But going back to this, I didn't tell you about the vortexes. Usually the vortexes are 3 mountains. If you take 3 major mountains and you triangulate them like this and you go to the very epicenter of that, you will have a major vortex. And This is why you will always find great UFO activity around a mountainous area. For instance, you go up to Mount Shasta. You've got Mount Shasta, you've got Mount Washington, McKinley's in there, Mount St. Helens and what have you. You can triangulate any of those, and you're going to end up with a vortexual area such as this, which is energy which is used by the extraterrestrials to do things, the same things they do with the pyramids and the crystals here upon the earth. Incidentally, I use the same principle when I put on sky demonstrations. In other words, I call in the UFOs. And I use that same vortexual energy to first send a beam of love up to contact them, and then they respond to the beam of love, and then they show themselves to us in the form of flyovers or sometimes even landings on the ground. We've had those. I've been doing that for now 23 or 24 years. Okay, now the lead up to the final element. We've gone through all of this. We've gone through the pyramid stage, we've gone through the crystal stage, all of it extraterrestrial in nature. We're still going through some of this, particularly the vortexual stage. But in the process of doing all this, in the process of using the crystals and the pyramids, they have been transforming you and I into a higher state of consciousness and frequency. So that metamorphosely, you might say, they have changed the structure, the molecular structure, if you will, and also the atomical structure of your body from one of corporeality, dust to dust, and earth to earth, to one of light. This is why we have such a tremendous, or have had, and it's now beginning to wane because it's time. This explains why we have had such a morbid fascination with crystals, you see. Because we recognize that crystals are an instrument of transformation. And there's a subliminal understanding that our bodies must become crystal-like or crystalline-like in order to facilitate incoming consciousness. Even though we're still in the flesh, that flesh, of course, is becoming crystalline in nature. You become the receptor. You become the transmitter. The transponder, and all these things, of course, are which are instruments of communications. This is what our body is going through right now. And so to return to something that I said earlier, you are the ultimate space vehicle, and that's the thing that's going to take you off of this planet. Your point in time of consciousness and your respondent body to the incoming consciousness. You notice above the head here I put the striations, which of course represents the nimbus, such as Jesus wore, that you will wear when you reach that final state, somewhere between now and the year 2000. That's not much. But believe me, hang on, because it's going to be joyful and tough at the same time. So you're in for a lot of either rude awakenings, or you're going to have one peppery ride, you know, and it'll be a great joy as opposed to whatever. The last thing I wish to say along that line is that the body is a vehicle. It's nothing more. It's good to have a nice body. I like a nice body. I respect other people with nice bodies. I like to look at both men and women and their bodies and their configurations and so forth. To me, it's pleasing to feel and to see somebody else's body that is in a balanced state. There's something very, important about it. And these balanced states that we're reaching right now will be the vehicles that we will, of course, use to transition. But the point is, we'll do one of two things. We'll drop the body, or we will take the body as it is in a transformational state, and we'll step from one dimension into the other and just continue where we have been headed all the while. Now let me point out to you also this, that there is little difference between the fourth dimension and the third dimension. The basic difference is the embodiment. Here you're in a physical body. It's an encumbrance as opposed to something which is facilitating. Over there, you're in your light body or your auric body or your electromagnetic body. And again, that is extraterrestrial in nature. Any questions so far on anything I've covered? Yes, sir.
How do you discern the difference between either dropping the body or transforming?
Well, in dropping the body, of course, it would probably be through an accident or death or something of that nature, an accidental death, okay? And some people will choose to go that way. And it will be so quick, though, that there'll be no pain, there'll be no even any expectations. It'll be done summarily, and you'll be removed from one vibration, the third dimension, into the fourth, and the body will be no more. At that point, you step into your real body, which of course is your etheric electromagnetic body.
The other process where you take this transformed body here with you to the other dimension.
Right, that's the process that we have been going through to reach this state here, you see, so that now we're in a light body as opposed to the body of corporeality, which we have been in for so long. There's a great deal more to it, but I can't go into depth today. But that's basically an overlighting of the principles. But that's the ultimate aim, to transform this body into a vehicle which can rise from the planet, hopefully, in toto. But if not, of course, if we are in the right frame of mind and reference and cosmic awareness and what have you, we'll be taken out into our other body, and we'll just drop this one and shed it. Not everybody will take the physical body with them. Yes?
The vortexes here, are they true vortexes?
Well, they're minor vortexes. They're not of the intensity nor the magnitude of the ones that I explained right here. All vortexes are an attraction for both, for polarities, for the good and the bad, so to speak. The vortexes that we have here have changed so over the years. They're polluted right now. And although they are a tourist attraction, they're not the old vortexes that I first knew when I came up here in the 70s and began to scout this whole area. The original energy, incidentally, of old Sedona, which was related to the vortexes, you'll find now in Cottonwood. And as you go across the bridge, there's a little subdivision there called Bridgeport. That old energy is right there on that farm to the right. It looks like a horse farm, and that's where you find it today. I don't know if they'll ever move it back here or not. I think they will, once we get over this craziness of tourism and all the other things that we're experiencing right now. And we do have some very, very heavy energies in here right now, too. We were talking about that earlier, and Melody asked me if I was going to mention it. I will mention it in passing only. And I would say to you that the information that I give you right now is to be used with discretion and is to be used judiciously, because it could be potentially dangerous to you or even those who are involved in it. We're talking about Boynton Canyon, we're talking about Long Canyon, Secret Canyon, and some of these other places out there. There are some very spooky things going on out there right now, and my advice to you is to stay out of it rather than get involved in it. Here recently there have been several mishaps back there where people have disappeared. There's also been 3 women found with their hearts cut out and things of this nature, and that's a clear warning to stay out of there, you see. I don't want to go into the depth or immensity of it. I will merely say that if you're aware with Groom 51, the Dulce incident and things like this, it's along those lines. And these are not uncommon things today, and I will be talking about it later, because we are, when I say we, I'm talking about the United States government, as well as other world powers, are involved and are in bed with the not so good, the ones I call the malefic ETs. And I don't think, and I have to believe, and I said that in my book, that our government, I don't think they're doing that by choice, but I don't think at the time that it occurred back in the 50s that they had any choice. And as a result of that, well, let me discuss it later. I'll go more in depth with it so you can have some realization or understanding of what I'm saying about the Sedona area. In answer to your question, there's a lot of crazy things going on here right now. Even the general consciousness, if you will, of Sedona right now is being affected due to these aberrant activities that are out there in that particular area. Now, you notice every day, too, that there are military-type craft flying in and out, you know, unmarked craft. Anytime you see that type of activity, you've got something going on that is not for public consumption. Again, for you and each and every one of you, I say this to you. Walk your talk, walk in love and light and balance. Let that thing alone. It'll take care of itself, you know, in time. And if they don't, then somebody else, extraterrestrial nature, will do it for them or for us, you know. You have to stay centered at this time. You have to use as your primary vehicle to get off of this planet that great power called love. There is no other power in the world more profound, more powerful than love. To show that, I'd like for each one of you to turn to yourself and somebody else next to you and say, I love you. Would you do that? Tell the person next to you, I love you. I love you, Doris. Yeah, thank you. Feel the power that comes through when you do that, you know, that power of love. It's all-encompassing. No greater power in the world than that. And if you want a resolution and you want an escape vehicle to get off this planet, use love, because it'll get you off. Okay, now you had a question, Doris.
Yes, I have a few.
You have a few?
Okay. Backing up a little bit. When you're talking about the extraterrestrial spirit form enters the body at about the 4th month of pregnancy. What if a lady that has an abortion would be into the issue of right to life versus right of choice? She has an abortion before the 4th month.
Then there's nothing lost. That's me saying that, of course. I see it's on video now, and it probably will cause a great deal of consternation and, for that matter, conjecture when it gets out there in public. But nonetheless, that is my understanding. In other words, if the child, or what they call the child, that little body is taken up to the 4th month, the intelligence and the consciousness is not there, so, right.
And how does that spirit of this extraterrestrial enter the womb after the 4th month? The mother obviously has no awareness of that.
No, she has. Well, she does sometimes. For instance, many women say that they're in communication with their child, say, around the 2nd month. Now, what they're not realizing is that the child is not in the womb. It's outside looking in, but it's still communicating. See, it's going into her aura, and it's communicating with her the things that it needs to dictate to her and so forth. But the finalization of that realization is around the 4th month when they move into the womb. That's when the veil's pulled. That's when we're closed down, especially when we come through the womb and that great agony that we experience in doing so, both the mother and the child. And the consciousness that we were originally aware of, the extraterrestrial nature, of course, is lost because, simply speaking, they say the veil is pulled, you see. But as we grow up and more, we became more enlightened and we gain more awareness. Of course, that veil's lifted until when we leave here, again, we'll have full recall of who we were, where we came from, and what we were here for.
Well, if it enters at the 4th month, what about the philosophy that the spirit enters the body of the newborn baby when it takes its first breath?
Well, of course, that again is basically a physical thing. Of course, you're talking about when it comes out of the womb, right? Okay. Yeah. Remember what I said, going back to that common denominator, the 4th month. There is consciousness there. When it comes out of the womb, of course, it comes into an entirely different world. It was in a support system as long as it was in the womb, and now it's coming into a hostile environment. And it really doesn't really want to breathe. That's why the doctor picks it up and smacks it on the little fanny, you know. And of course, it begins to happen. But at that point on, of course, I can remember myself. I'm a twin. And I almost have full recall of coming out of the womb. And in my ages 1, 2, and 3, I can remember those vividly, you know. And I can go right back to spankings I got and admonishments and all the other things. I remember them very vividly. And okay, you got another question?
Yes.
Okay.
They're talking about the pyramids, and you were citing certain ones in Hawaii, in the Great Lakes region, etc. You didn't mention the common ones in Mexico and Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Are those included also, or are they just
No.
also
You know, strangely enough, the pyramids, which many of them are Mayan based and so forth, were not in that original 12. I located the 5 in our particular area, Hawaii, Canada, and then the United States. Those are the major ones. But there are many others that are auxiliary in nature, which is supportive of the major ones. You see, the 12 major ones.
So the ones in Mexico and Egypt are excluded?
Yeah, Tiwanaku and all those, they're very valid. I periodically, I haven't done it for a while, but I used to take tours down into Belize, into the ancient Mayan ruins down there, into some very pristine, beautiful, pure pyramids down there in ruins. And I think sometime in the future, again, I'll do it. Okay. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Could you explain or comment on the, as far as reincarnation and karmic death, each lifetime on this planet and upon the death of the physical body, the spirit returns to home base? Or
yeah. Well, it doesn't go back to its home base, although in its home base it has awareness of its home base. What happens for the most part, we go back to we go into training, you know, preparatory to being reintroduced here to pick up where we left off. Unless we have fulfilled the requirements of a given lifetime, we must always come back to redo it, because it's like going to school. If you flunk a grade, which many times we've done it in the past, then we come back to redo it until we master it, and then of course we go on to the next higher level of requirements or our consciousness. So now, the remarkable part, and I think the most beautiful part right now, is that we are in the last series of karma. Every one of you, including me, is back here to make that final, or make it final, I should say, is a good word for it. Now, not everybody will make it. And there's an interesting aspect here, too, that is happening, and while we're talking about that, and your question prompts it, are you finding these things of interest? I don't want to lose your interest now. And I will get into the harem-scarum, you know, of the ETs and so forth a little later. But these things I think are very important too. Let's see, where was I with your question?
From previous lives and karmic death, and where the soul or spirit goes between lives.
You triggered something there, and it went from in one ear and out the other.
You said everyone would not resolve their karma prior to...
I said, yeah, I said that each one of us are here for the last time. Oh, okay. There is another alternative to that. That's what I wanted to talk about. Apparently they didn't want you to know it, huh? You have to watch the kind of forces that are in here. All right, there's a simultaneous scenario taking place right now. Sonia, honey, could I have that spray on? It's getting a little tight here. There's a scenario, thank you, dear. There's a scenario which is going on right now that is simultaneous in nature. And according to the Indians, and of course I will make reference to it again tomorrow, the Indians state that there are three primary migrations from this planet before we ascend into the fourth and fifth dimension. The first one began and took place in 1990. And the next one will be 1996. And the last one will be in the year 1999. Those are three major population migrations. Now, what does that mean? Illustratively, this is what's happening. The planet right now, this is us, is undergoing its current transformation and process for graduation. Simultaneously with that is another planet, which goes back to your question too. There are those upon the planet right now who will not make it. Now, it's a ready concern, but it's a true one, you see. Not all of us are going to make it. We never have, and we never will, until time, of course, plays out. And let me tell you, too, that God doesn't care as long as you make it. He doesn't care when you make it, as long as you make it. So many times, of course, there are those who can't quite get it together, and they have to repeat it again. Now, there is a distinct difference this time around, though, as opposed to previous times. In previous times, if we didn't make it, we just blipped in again when we wanted to, you see, And then we did a little bit more, and then we left and came back and did a little bit more and what have you. The difference this time is that you have to do it or you don't. There's no sitting on the fence. There's no chance to do it again. You either do it or you don't. And this is what Jesus meant when he said, I shall separate the wheat from the tares. You're not a fence sitter anymore, and you can't be. You have to make up your mind, either on a conscious level or on a intuitive and a subliminal level. This planet, despite all else, will graduate with or without you. They don't care. The essential part is, as I said, it must go and join the sisterhood and brotherhood of planets, which is waiting for them. The planet is a living organism. It has a consciousness of its own. It is accommodating you and I right now. Now, when the time comes to move, it will take only with it those who are ready. The question then, what happens to the others? Well, there's another planet that's already in a state of readiness. Right now it's in the etheric. And let's say that the line of division is here. This planet, the one we're talking about, which is the substitute planet for planet Earth, is in what we would call the fourth dimension right now. In other words, it's in the etheric. In these mass migrations, for instance, 1990, 1996, 1999, these people, or I'll put it this way, these dates are designed for those laggards. The Bible talks of the laggards. And indeed, there is such a thing. The laggards will go from this planet and be taken up to the new planet, which will be the new planet Earth, new Earth, which will come back to the third dimension. This will ultimately come down and, of course, take up the same position that our current planet has, and they'll begin all over again. So this process of 1990, 1996, 1999 will be the removal of those who cannot and will not accommodate incoming Christ Spirit, and who cannot be a part of the graduation ceremony, so to speak. They will go here after they die, in the etheric. They'll take up residence upon this new planet, and they'll be in a state of, shall we say, sleep. They'll be held there until the proper time. And then when this planet goes up, as this one goes up, this one comes down, you see. We go into the fourth and fifth dimension as a planet, and the peoples, if we are part of that consciousness and vibration, this one, of course, will come down and occupy the original position of our current Earth. Yes?
Is it actually the same physical Earth, or is it an entirely different body replacing the other?
No, it'll be, in other words, they will come down into the third dimension, which is a physical reality, this planet here.
But it's really the same Earth.
Yeah, it's the same Earth. And we will go up into the etheric, in other words, the fourth and fifth dimension. Any more questions on that? Does that help you? Did that clarify it for you? You sure now? Because if it didn't, I want to make sure that I do. So this prophecy here is according to the Indians, and I'll be talking about it tomorrow, of course, in the Ultimate Indian Prophecy. Look at all things in God's eyes. God doesn't do anything by mistake. God has a plan for everything, and everything is orchestrated and to suit the needs and desires, not only of the source itself, but all those, of course, who are involved. When you study these things, as I have for over the 23 years and so forth, the more you study it, the more reality and, shall I say, perception that comes in. You get a better understanding of the schematic of things. Yes?
Could you tell us a little bit more about that switching? Why are they taking one planet out? We talked about the Earth graduating. Where is this other planet coming from, and why is there being a switch? I mean, what are the dynamics, and what are the reasons for that?
Well, the dynamics are pretty much what I said right here. One will go up, the other one will come down. There has to be a repository. There has to be a place for those laggard souls who are not ready to graduate, Here again, I want to impress upon your mind that you mustn't make a judgment about that. These are people who have chosen not to be ready at this time, or perhaps they are destined to be the leaders in the future. We don't know. We just know that they are the laggards and they will not graduate this time, and they will come back to do it again. Yes?
When you talk about the whole system of the planet that's getting ready to graduate, and we're going to join that system that's graduating, well, we're going to be part of that system, is the new Earth that's coming down, is there a kindred bunch of planets that will then be replaced also? In other words, what will be the home of the new planet relative to the planets that are presently here? I mean, will be the same ones that are here except for the Earth?
Well, if you remember, I said that we will become a part of the sisterhood and brotherhood of planets. That then becomes one consummate energy. And that consummate energy, of course, will graduate in toto into one energy and will become a part of the fourth and fifth dimension and whatever those experiences offer. This planet, of course, although it's in the fourth dimension in etheric right now, it necessarily has to be, it will then descend into density, again, you see, into the third dimension and take on the physicality of the original planet, the one that we're experiencing right now. Again, it's by divine plan. They just can't throw those people out. You can't throw the baby out with the wash, so to speak. So there has to be preparation for that next generation that will go through the procedure of being here in the physical again, the third dimension. Yes, Melody?
But it is also to fill the void in the solar spin of all the planets. You can't just take one out and have nothing there. So
yeah, you have to fill the void. That's exactly right. A good explanation, Melody. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Well, this new third dimension planet will have to be cleansed as far as our third dimensional realities or experiences.
They'll basically start out in a primeval state, just as we did. In other words, from the very basics. And then progressively they will work up into other elements of consciousness until they will reach, of course, the same cyclic evolution that we have in the past. Again, much of it is predicated upon their own abilities to, to grow and what have you. Now, there is another scenario which I have not discussed that is a possibility, and that is that our planet here, I will begin to talk about it shortly, is controlled by a parental planet called Wormwood. And when you understand Wormwood, and incidentally it is mentioned in the Bible in Revelations chapter 8, verse 11, I believe it is, the Wormwood peoples actually put us here, as Charles Hoy Fort said, to farm us. We have been biologically and extraterrestrially coded and genetically engineered, if you will. And we are, in a sense, prototypes of that parental energy and planet called Wormwood. I'll go into that in just a minute so that you can have more understanding of what I'm saying. Okay? Incidentally, too, if you go back as far as the Sumerian Chronicles, and if you wish to study them, and they are available for study, you will find the first hint and statement that we were put here, not by God, but by some other power, extraterrestrial in nature. And what they're known as Wormwood, they're known as Marduk, they're known as Niburnal, and there's one other, Nibiru. So all of those are names for the same energy or consciousness that actually put us here. And what I do, I lump it into one understanding, and I call it the lesser gods. This isn't the true God who put us here, it's the lesser gods who put us here to farm us and to use us. And which they have done, over the millenniums. And we, with this graduation ceremony, which we're about to make right now, we will break that control which they have exercised over us for so long. It's an interesting story. I'll talk about it a little later. Any more questions on this? Yes. Michael, did you have a question?
That's okay. Next one.
The next one? Next question, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody understand what I'm talking about here? In other words, how we're shifting in consciousness and how some of us will make it and some of us won't. I would have to say that I think everybody in this room, since you're here to listen, will make it, But there are many out there that will not. And you cannot, incidentally, be judgmental. You can't judge Saddam Hussein. Incidentally, Saddam Hussein is playing a very important role in the Middle East. We look at him and say he's a turkey, he's insane, he's a bastard, and he's all this and that, but he's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. We cannot, incidentally, while we're talking about this, we as a planet and the peoples cannot graduate from the third dimension into the fourth and fifth between now and the year 2000 until such time that Middle Eastern crisis has been put to rest. Now let me throw something at you which might be a little bit mind-boggling. There's two major rays upon the planet. One is feminine in aspect and one is masculine. The feminine aspect has always been anchored previously in Tibet. And it's been under the guardianship and care of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, when the communists invaded, summarily took that ray, and with him in his mass exodus, he took it with him, and he took it down into South America, and he anchored it in Lake Titicaca. The feminine ray of the planet now is sitting down there waiting for its partner or its twin soul or twin flame. Guess where the twin flame is? Right smack dab in the Middle East. All the things that are happening over there right now. That's the old machizoistic energy, macho. Look what they do to women over there, you know. The real power, of course, it lies with the women at this point, not the men. We've lost it. The women are going to pick it up and do something with it. They have to if we are to survive. Now, in the meantime, the arena for future development, in the meantime, the arena for all of this to come to pass lies in the Middle East. And Saddam Hussein, just as Hitler did, Hitler played a divine role, so is Saddam Hussein. These energies, archaic in nature, macho in nature and so forth, have to be rendered into a useful harmonic form, or we cannot graduate. Believe this, we cannot graduate as a planet in peoples. So what we're looking at in the future, some of the most horrendous experiences we're going to have is going to be as a result of the Middle East crisis. Because that thing cannot come back to its rightful place until all of that energy, which is currently over there, which is macho in nature, until it has been expiated. When it is, then the new masculinity that comes out of there, which will be, I can't say feminine in nature, it'll be a soft masculine energy. That energy then will be moved to Lake Titicaca, will be married up with its divine complement. You see, the feminine ray that's down there right now. At that point, our planet is ready to ascend into the fourth and fifth dimension. So look and hold on tight for things that are going to happen. This is prophecy I'm giving you. For things that are going to happen in the Middle East. It's going to get worse before it gets better. We're sitting on a powder keg over there. And I don't know how many people are divinely aware of what's going on, but what I'm telling you is the truth. You know, it's the expiation of that old masculine energy, which is now archaic and also insane. Totally insane. You had a question, sir?
You answered it for me.
Okay, good. Yes, Doris.
Let's move back to these dates.
Here.
You said that according to Native American prophecies, there are 3 population migrations. Could you
Of the laggards. Only of the laggards.
Okay, they're migrating where? Is that this?
To the new planet, which...
On the Earth. I mean, the whole Earth is migrating.
Yes, we will. Those who can accommodate incoming spirit will stay with the planet as it too raises into the fourth and fifth dimension, and then they will move up into the sisterhood and brotherhood of planets. In other words,
So one of the migrations was 1990.
these are for the laggards only. You see, they will go to this new Earth planet, which is now in the etheric, which will then become solidified as it moves down into the third dimension, and then it becomes a new planet Earth. As one goes up, the other one comes down. Okay? Yes, sir.
Is that etheric planet possibly opposite of our Earth on the other side of the sun? So Earth, not necessarily.
You know, I couldn't answer that question. Truthfully, I don't know. All I know is it's out there, and where it physically is approximated and what have you, I couldn't answer it. I will tell you this, since you brought up the subject of the sun. The sun is not what we think it is. The sun is indeed the 12th planet. And the 12th planet is the planet of Michael. And when we see the sun and we look at it materialistically, we say solar flares and all this, you see. But what you're really looking at is the radiance, if you will, of the great ones who abide on that planet, including the solar region. Solar region is the one we know as the Christ. All of the 12 major archangels also abide on that planet. Now, I had the great privilege, again, I was working with the Pueblo Indians up in Taos. Some profound things happened to me up there. I used to sun gaze every morning, and it was part of my meditation procedures. And one morning, I was taken totally out of body, and I went into the sun. The sun parted, and behind those rays was this most beautiful, pristine planet I've ever seen, as were the individuals who habitated it. I didn't want to come back, really. It was so gorgeous. And, but I made the mistake. I saw there were two men coming from this direction and two from this direction, and they met on a sidewalk, and they stopped to converse. And what I did, I tried to get in closer so I could eavesdrop. And when I did it, I broke it, and I was back in body, and it was over. But what it told me was that, at that point, was that what we think is reality about the sun is not so. That's a materialistic, physical appraisal of it. What we're looking at, of course, is the high intensity of the radiance of the people who abide on that planet. To look upon them, even as the sun, if we're not ready for it, could blind us. This is the highest state of consciousness you could possibly be in, you know, along with the Christ and the 12 archangels. Yes?
Also, I've heard that in the higher dimensions, in the fifth dimension, that while in the third dimension, 12 is a very important number, that will resonate more with 16. You know, anything about that?
12 is a very magical number used by not just the Christ, but also by the Creator itself. For instance, if you were to take the universal template and grid system right down to the planetary template and grid system, it's constituted in sequences of 12. In other words, there's 144 parts to any given template and grid system. 12 times 12 is, of course, 144. So it's a magical number. And then, of course, above that, we always have the one who is more or less the overseer, such as Jesus and the 12 disciples. You find this characteristic and similarity all through the thinking and energies of the one we know as the Creator. It's a very, now the number 16 you mentioned, didn't you?
I've heard that in the higher dimensions it will become raised to 16 as being. Have you heard any possibility?
No, I haven't. 16, of course, equates to a 7, which, of course, is spiritual. It could, if I was to reduce that, I could say it's probably corresponded to the 7 different levels of consciousness of man. You know, 1 is 6 is 7. Incidentally, the Christ came back, Jesus, the one we know as Jesus, came back from the 5th dimension. So that will give you some idea of where we're going this time around. We're going up to the same level of which he was when he came back. That is our ultimate destiny, and it's a beautiful, beautiful realization. The 4th dimension is very much like our own. It's in the etheric. Propagation, for instance, over there isn't physical in nature, it's by the mind. Man and woman make a pact, you know, and we do have couples over there, just as we do here, but it's not in the same frame of reference. For instance, let's say that Doris and I were married over there and we wanted a child. We wouldn't copulate to do it, we would do it with our minds. And we discuss it first, we want a boy or a girl. Well, we agreed, so let's say a girl. All right, what color hair do we want to have? Well, we agreed blonde. What color eyes? Blue, and so forth. So we come up with a blueprint of what it is that we want and should have and so forth. And then we create that with our own mind. We pull it then down into our reality and dimension, and that child is usually born somewhere around 9 or 10 years old. They don't go through all that infantile stage, you see. They're productive and useful when they're born. And then what we do, we assign that child to a, although we have the parental love and the bonding and all things that take place, the child is destined to be a part of the overall community. Say if it's a boy, so they need an engineer, we're lacking engineers, we make sure that our boy becomes an engineer. And so the birth is for the good of the all, you see. And it's done in a very loving, compassionate, and balanced way. That's the difference between here and there. But you can see we're doing the same things, but in a different way, and a different methodology. But the one thing is that I do live my truth. And if I make a statement, I take the responsibility for it, and I will live it, you know. And I'd finished up a large presentation in California, and a lady in the question and answer period, she asked me what I thought about channeling. And of course, so knows this, but And I said to her, well, believe it or not, I said, channeling is over. If you're going to channel, channel yourself. And if you're going to channel, take responsibility for what you channel. Don't say it's Sananda, don't say it's Kathumi, don't say it's St. Germain or whoever it may happen to be. If it's you doing it, say so and take the responsibility for it. Because so many of the channels were channeling themselves and they were foisting it off on some other being, you know, so they wouldn't have to take the responsibility for the do's and don'ts that they were putting forth, you see. And so I took them to task on it, and that's why I told her, I said, channeling is over, unless you're channeling yourself, and if you do channel yourself, say it's me, and I take the responsibility. This is what I feel, this is what I see, this is what I sense, or whatever, however you want to say it, you know. But don't lay it off on somebody else. You are the gods. You must never forget this. Jesus said it 2,000 years ago, know ye not to your gods. You are gods who have been in amnesia. You've forgotten that you're gods. But each and every one of you are. And it's time for awakening, reawakening, if you will. And as we do that, the things that have been imposed upon us, which you're about to hear, by the lesser gods in the past, are going to be removed, and we once again will step into the glory of our godship. And that's what makes this whole scenario, upcoming in nature, so dynamic, so important, and so beautiful. Because we're coming back to that final realization of who we really are and we're here for. So it's a very, very precious time that we're experiencing. Now, I said, you know, it's rather salt and pepper. There are going to be times ahead when some of us are going to experience trials and tribulations. The degree of which, of course, as I've already said too, will be dictated by your consciousness, not somebody else's, you know. So if you are one with the source, you are one with the Christ and the incoming Christed energies, you need not worry. And remember too what I said earlier, that the greatest power here upon earth that you have going for you is love, L-O-V-E, the greatest power. I could tell you story after story about how love has saved my life. The years that I have worked with the Indians, the 23 years I've had, and I'll talk about some of it tomorrow, I've been in impossible situations where by all rights I should be dead. But using the power of love, using the power of faith and love and light balance, I have come through them miraculously. And I'll talk about some of that tomorrow. There's no one on this earth who knows the power of love, I don't believe, any better than I do. And I'm an old hard-nosed. You know, I'm a retired military man. I had 23 years in the service. I had 9 years with the CIA. I had 10 years with the Green Berets. I had 3 times in Vietnam. I was in the Second World War. I was in a civil war, 3 revolutions, the Korean War. I fought in Malaysia with the British, the Dutch, and the New Zealanders, and also the Aussies. And then I had 3 times in Vietnam. Not to mention some of the secret assignments, of course, I had with the CIA. And then to come to the realization that I am today, and look back on all that, you know, which I don't regret. I did what I had to do at that time. But to look back and to see where others failed, others were killed, and I came through all of that, to do what I'm doing today, it blows my mind. It really does. And I wonder sometimes how I can be so fortunate to survive all that and do the things that I do today. It blows my mind. I'm eternally grateful for being able to do the things that I do. And there isn't a night that I don't kneel down and thank the Creator, you know, for the privilege of being able to do the things that I do. And of course, I am a messenger, and my primary thrust in life is to touch the hearts and minds and souls of others, and to share with them the great and beautiful things that are given to me. There is no greater joy or no greater reward than I receive through you. Okay. Where do we go from here? Are there any questions on anything that you know I've covered so far in terms of some of the things that I've mentioned. Is there any gray areas you'd like to discuss before I get into something new? Yes, sir.
The one you mentioned that we are gods, and the other you mentioned the wormwood and that we are created by lesser gods. Maybe could you?
Yes, I'm about to get into that. I'll go into it in depth at this moment, and that will be my next subject. Okay. Any other questions regarding the previous discussions? Okay, let's talk about that then. Let's talk about the wormwood planets. Incidentally, too, so you can better understand where I come from in terms of UFOs. Excuse me just a minute. My background, militarily, as I've already established, 23 years in the service. As a young captain in 1948, I was in on the capture of the second UFO, actually the third UFO, because in Roswell, which preceded this capture by 1 year, we captured 2 UFOs in the Roswell incident. And it's the most talked about, documented, and I'd say, yeah, talked about and documented incident there is in the world. It's become the centerpiece for all discussions on ufology, so to speak. But the one that is still most secret and not talked about is the one that I was in on, which of course was the White Sands incident, which was a sequel to the Roswell incident. So it was during that time in 1948 that I became aware that there was such a thing as a UFO or an extraterrestrial type craft. And maybe I should talk about that first, and then I'll go into your scenario about the Wormwood peoples and how they put us here to farm us. So let's do that. Let's establish how I became involved in the field of ufology. And as I already established, it took place in 1948. As a young captain, I had just finished a tour of the CIA, and all military people who are involved in classified projects in Washington, D.C. or someplace like that must periodically go back to their branch, their parent branch, Army, Navy, Air Force, and they must receive what they call hands-on training. I was a captain at the time, a young captain, 24 years old, and I needed, according to them, company commander time. Now, with the CIA, and of course, it started out as OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, that's where I began. Then it became SSU, Strategic Service Unit, and then it became CIG, Central Intelligence Group, and then it became what we know it as today as the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. And I was with them through that whole period, you see. So all my combat experience and what have you was behind the lines and was a guerrilla type of operation as opposed to the conventional frontline soldier. And in their opinion, I needed that experience too. So I was then put on leave to go to an organization to learn hands-on company commander time. And I was reassigned since I was already airborne qualified. I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I finished my time as a company commander, and of course I had such an extensive intelligence background that they automatically, as soon as I finished my time, they pulled me up to division level, division staff level. They made me the G2 Air and the photo interpretation officer of the 82nd Airborne Division. To fulfill that, they sent me to school in Anacostia Naval Base to study photo interpretation and photogrammetry. And I never dreamed I would do something like this, but it was most interesting. And then, of course, I came back to my unit as the new G2 Air photo interpretation officer. After I had fulfilled this obligation, or during the time I was fulfilling it, the Air Force and the Army had a joint operation which was highly classified, which they needed people with a top secret clearance to be involved in, and I happened to be one of those. And of course, I was chosen to work on this particular operation. Even looking back on it today, I don't see whether it was that classified, but nonetheless, at that time it was. Now, I was reassigned to the Air Force then on what they call temporary duty as a G2 Air component. In other words, representing the Army, and I was directly in line with the Air Force, what they call a G2 Air. So there was an Air Force G2 Air and an Army G2 Air, and the two of us worked together on all intelligence and air phenomena. Anything that had to do with air or unusual phenomenal intelligence and so forth, that was our bailiwick, so to speak. In the midst of this, one day we received a fax which came across the commander's desk, came down from 3rd Army Headquarters to V Corps, which was our parental organization, down to the Air Force, the commander of the Air Force, and then of course across my desk and also the G2 Airs of the Air Force. And there was a Twix, a cable form like a fax today, okay? That simply said that an unidentified flying object had soft landed in the middle of White Sands, New Mexico. Now, to get some understanding and feeling for White Sands, New Mexico, White Sands, New Mexico, even today, is one of the most sensitive, highly classified areas in the world. There's none more sensitive than they are. And the reason for this was, this is where we first exploded the first atomic bomb. And this is where we also did the other research on other nuclear weapons and so forth. It all takes place right there at White Sands, New Mexico. So we can see that it's a very, very intense and highly sensitive area. And for an unidentified flying object, a UFO, to summarily land in the middle of it, unannounced and what have you, you can imagine what it did to the high command, you know. And so it was not only startling, it was frightening. So what happened at that point then, because of my top secret clearance and because of my need to know, it was air phenomena, I was assigned to monitor this. And so what I will do now is to relate to you the sequence of events which took place at that time in 1948 in White Sands, New Mexico. The first thing, as I said, was an announcement that an unidentified flying object had landed, soft landed. Whereas previously, in the year 1947, during the Roswell incident, those craft did not soft land, they impacted. And we don't know exactly what happened. We can suspect and we can re-examine it and what have you. We somehow or other, the basic agreement is that our radar interfered with their navigational system to the extent that they could not judge the distance from the craft to the ground. And they got too close to the proximity of the ground, the gravitation took over and so forth, their instruments were off, and what they did, they hit and they skipped over the surface of the earth, and as they did so, the craft itself, of course, disintegrated, went into bits and pieces, the bodies were strewn out, and so it became remnants of what once was. Out of that, though, I'm now talking about the Roswell incident before I get into mine. Out of that, we did get one live EB, what we call EB, extraterrestrial biological entity, EB. We got one of them alive, and I didn't bring it with me, but he's a very common picture today on many UFO flyers and things like this, a dead extraterrestrial. That is a picture of one of the ones that we captured and took, of course, in 1947 in the Roswell incident. The others were there, they were basically dead, and of course some of them, of course, were torn to pieces along with the craft itself, and we got bits and pieces and fragments. Well, there was the first incident, and then following almost within the week after that, there was one more incident where we had a like phenomena. In other words, a ship impacting, bodies being spewed, the craft itself falling into pieces and so forth. Now that's what made the White Sands incident so much more unusual, because this time they damn well presented that thing to us intact, as opposed to what we had before, you see, bits and pieces. Incidentally, the live EB lived for a while. He didn't live too long. Later on, from another craft, we got one that lived for 12 years. And he was put in a hermetically sealed area, which was akin to his own environment. There was a young captain assigned to him who was to correspond with him and all his needs and so forth. They became the best of friends. Incidentally, when the EB died, the young captain then was a full bird, and over 12 years, and they became the greatest of friends, incidentally. And he was the only, the captain, then later the colonel, was the only one that he would talk to. But we got a lot of information out of him, you know, in terms of the extraterrestrial knowledge we needed to know technologically and mentally and what have you. So it was a very blessed event. We've had others since then which we have captured. I could have to tell you that we have hundreds of ships throughout the world now that we've either captured or they have been presented to us. And I don't know how many bodies or live entities we have at this time. If we were to view it from, say, the Zeta Reticuli point of view and our underground bases and so forth, they're in the hundreds, at least hundreds. But to go back to the incident which I'm talking about, to bring you up to date now, 1948. As soon as that craft soft landed, what happened was they threw a cordon of security around it and kept it under observation because we wanted to see whether or not their intentions were hostile, or perhaps there was nobody aboard and the craft just landed, summarily. In other words, it was a presento. Or were all the occupants dead? These were questions we were asking ourselves at that time. And so after 24 hours, they decided that one or two options was true. They were all aboard and they were dead, or there was nobody aboard at all. Now, there was a high state of suspicion about the craft, whether it was radioactive and whether it could be approached with immunity, So in the initial phase, rather than going up and touching the ship and looking for a magic button to bring down a door, they got a long pole and put several men on it, about 10 men, and they began to probe like this. And Providence would have it, sooner or later they hit a button and down came a door from the inside, and we now had access to the craft. And so it was time then for volunteers, you, and you, to board the craft and to see what was actually aboard. Well, the boarding party did go, and I won't go into the details of the ship. I will say this, that the ship was very simplified, and yet it was so highly technical that we could not understand it, For instance, the blank walls, of course, it was electronically controlled and everything. Pictures, just like much you see on Star Trek and things like this, these things were true of this craft, From the apparent look, first look, it was so simple. There wasn't hardly any hardware there at all, and yet when you got into it, it was highly technical. The main object of curiosity, though, later, of course, we did the investigation on the craft and got a lot from it in terms of our own technology, but the main interest was who was aboard. And what we found aboard were 5 bodies. And these 5 bodies were unusual because they were diminutive in size. The largest one was just under 4 feet, and he had epaulets on, indicating he probably was a commander. There was one other who was smaller than him who had epaulets on, indicating he possibly was the assistant commander. All the ones other than the commander himself were 3.5 feet, which puts them somewhere in here, you see. And they were, as I said, diminutive in size. They had on very tight-fitting silver uniforms, skin tight, and with no seeming openings, no buttons, no zippers, nothing of that nature. It looked as though they had been poured into the suit itself, you see. And the color of the suit itself was a metallic gray. And the heads of all the individuals, I should have brought some pictures with me today, but the heads were outsized compared to the body. Whereas our head is small compared to, say, the rest of our body, their bodies were compared in relationship to their heads. The heads were outsized, indicating that basically they were cerebral in nature and of high intelligence and so forth. The characteristics of the face itself was such that they had no nose, they had no ears. The nose and the ears had atrophied so that there was only orifices or holes in the side of the head. The rest of the ear, of course, had disintegrated, as did the nose. The mouth itself was immobile. In other words, it was not flexible like ours and couldn't be used, and didn't need to be used. And obviously they were using mental telepathy, to communicate, as we discovered later on. The dome of the head itself, there was no hair in the body at all. They were completely bald. There was an anomaly in that the faces were purple and bluish in nature, where the rest of the skin, the skin that was exposed at that point, like the hands and what have you, was an alabaster white. So there was a distinct anomaly there between the texture color of the face and the hands and the rest of the body. And later on, we solved that mystery in that we found that they had blown a portal. and that they had suffocated from strangulation or asphyxiation. And so therefore, that had turned their face into the purple hue that we saw, you see. But basically, in their original form, they were as white as Melody's coat, very white. And not the grays that we talk about today, but they were white. The bodies were taken off of the craft. And of course, what we wanted to do was determine the sex of the occupants, whether male, female, or mixed, or whatever. And so at this time, the Air Force, as we know it today, had just become the Air Force. We have moved them from the Army Air Corps back in '48 into what is now known today as the Air Force. Their headquarters was in Wright-Patterson, Ohio. So it was agreed that the bodies, of course, be flown from New Mexico, White Sands, which is outside of Alamogordo, to Wright-Patterson, where they would be placed on ice and then leisurely examined. The reports that came back from that was that, of course, they did fly them back there. They did take the uniforms off of them, but they had great difficulty. They thought probably what they could do, they could come in with a pair of scissors and they could cut at the neck, you know, and then begin to cut down and finally peel the uniform away from them. They couldn't budge it. There was no pair of scissors or anything, even a knife, that could cut that material. And they finally resorted to using tin shears. Tin shears was the only thing had the tensile strength and power to actually cut that little uniform. And that uniform was less than the thickness of the common everyday newspaper, one sheet of it, you know. But it had great strength. When we got it off of them, or when they did, and got them into the nude and so forth, they discovered, of course, that they were all male. The remnants of what was once testes and penis and so forth was there, but like the mouth and like the ears and the nose, it was dysfunctional and had reached a state of atrophy wherein it was non-functional. They discovered the same thing when they got inside, when they performed an autopsy and opened them up. They found out that they had the remnants of human organs, such as kidneys and liver and all that. But again, it was obvious that they had not used it for maybe millenniums, I don't know. So they had shrunk into a form of diminutiveness. In other words, they were there, the remnants were there, but they were not functional. So this told us then, it's one of the reasons that I put on the cover of my book, ETs and UFOs, they need us, we don't need them. The obvious answer to all of this was that they have chosen both some of the good and the bad, particularly the bad. They have chosen to pursue technology and mentality as opposed to spirituality or humanness, you see. And in the process, they have lost these very things which now turn out to be sacred. The mouth, the ears, the nose, the internal organs that we have as humans. These things are now coveted and wanted very much by those who are amongst us, who are taking from us through abductions the things that they have lost. And this is why, if I was to get into abductions in great depth, you would find that's the reason why people are abducted. To stop momentarily on that before I get back to my regular scenario, what they do, they're trying, number one, to form a hybrid human to regain that which they have lost. They've lost their humanness. They've lost their emotions. They've lost the ability to love. They've lost all the things that have become sacred at this time to you and I and to other parts of the guardian force's consciousness. And so now they see that they're losing the race. They are becoming extinct, and they're trying to use us. They have lost, you say. From the when a woman is abducted and taken aboard one of these craft, the first thing they do is to examine her sexually. And they take from her, of course, ovarial eggs. They take, for instance, for all classification, they take blood. They take enzymes. They take genetic splices. From the men, they take their semen. From the women, they take their ovarial eggs. They take vaginal juices. And necessary in a laboratory environment to create, in an embryonic stage, a new hybrid human. And they have many, many babies. Many of them, of course, are grotesque in nature because they're not exactly you might say an exact replica of a human, and they have some of the characteristics of the extraterrestrial and the characteristics of the human. Many of the women abductions, incidentally, are taken aboard a craft to nurture and nursemaid these hybrid children, to give the child motherly love, to give the child affection. The things that they can't do, they're using women for, to do for them in these laboratorial types of environments. And I don't think, my personal opinion, I can't say for sure, but I don't think that they have come to the final point of creating a human being that is fully human. There are those amongst us who are human-looking like, but they do not have the sacred things that we have in terms of love, emotions, and the things that are essential for graduation. And unless there's a dramatic change in all of their consciousness, I don't see where they're going to win the race, really. I think they've gone too far, too long, and they're whistling Dixie, so to speak. Again, that's why I said in the book back there, when I talked about ETs, they need us, we don't need them. That's exactly where it is. They keep telling us that we need them. We do not. We have the essentials. We have the ingredients. We have all the things that they need to reclaim that which they have lost. Yes?
Interrupting for a question. It seems like we as human beings want to constantly evolve
To get to that more spiritual state.
To make the same mistake that they did.
Make the same mistake they did. That's
Yeah.
what we're doing.
As long as we pursue it spiritually, we're right on target. But when we forget spiritual and set that aside and go for technology and mentality, then we fall into the same trap that they did, you see. That's the one thing that they're not doing. Yes, sir.
Where do these ETs come from if they're not part of these 12 planets they're going to?
Or many, many different places. The planet is open. There's at least 18 civilizations, extraterrestrial in nature, that are here right now amongst us. The Pleiadians, the Reticuli, and many others, of course, if I was to go into them.
They're not part of the planetary, the one that we're going to be merging with.
No, no.
Okay.
No, you see, the planet is in the process of graduation, and as I said earlier, we even have people in here from the lower astral right now. This is sort of, it's like sending the scrub team in when you play football. We say, okay, go in and take your turn, you know, and see what you can do. So a lot of these are coming in right now, and we have an admixture of consciousnesses in here right now at this point. The one true thread and theme, of course, are the ones, of course, that I was propounding later, or earlier, I should say, when I was talking about love and light and balance, receiving the incoming Christ consciousness and all that. Those are the true beings who will graduate into the fourth and fifth dimension. Okay? Question back here. Yes, sir.
Well, my question was whether or not these ETs can be classified in terms of dimension.
In terms of what?
In terms of dimension or energy, like low energy, high energy.
Yes, they can. And, of course, the ones I'm talking about, for instance, when I say that they are technologically and mentally superior to us, they certainly have mastered the different elements of consciousness that they have done. But they are basically from, and we have to say that the world is divided in our own consciousness into what we would call darkness and light. And they fall on the darker side of things. Now realize this, that negative and positive, dark and light and all that is the same consciousness, but it's a division of our own consciousness. We have created that, you might say, for the benefit of our growth. You're still talking about God. If you talk about Hitler and the things he did, you're still talking about a divine being. If you talk about the forces of darkness, you're still talking about an aspect of the Creator, which is something that we have drawn to ourselves, you see, to experience. You talk about the forces of light, again, you're talking about an aspect of the Creator itself. And that's all in one package, but divided by you and I. Yes, sir?
Well, I mean, I can see where these beings without ears and without mouths could just develop other senses, more or less. Like if we didn't speak for a period of time and we could hone in on telepathic...
Telepathic communications, right, and they do that. And in many respects, I could say that they're superior to us, even including the bad ones, you say. But the most essential thing which they need for graduation are the very things that we have, and that's why we're so important to them.
We need them
Well, yes, in a sense that's right, but they need us more than we need them, you know. For those of us who can walk in love and light and balance and be one with the Creator, we don't need the technology. Now, I'll get back to my main story in a minute about the White Sands, New Mexico incident. But since you brought up a very good point there, I'd like to explain something to you. I've had the privilege of working with 2 extraterrestrial communities here upon planet Earth. One of them was right here in Arizona back in the 70s in the vicinity of Wickenburg here, you know where that is, about 120 miles from here, in the vicinity of a place called Vulture Peak. And I had an ongoing liaison with them. It's in my book back there. I talk about it. Ongoing liaison with them for almost 2 years, maybe a little bit more. And then I had another experience that happened in Northern California. I stayed with that group for about 6 months near the Beale Air Force Base. Anybody know where Beale Air Force Base is? You know where Grass Valley is? Grass Valley. It's not too far from Sacramento, up in that general area, a little place called Rough and Ready. And I had a 6 months tenure with that particular extraterrestrial group. The first group I'm talking about, we had more or less an oppositional relationship, and it's a wonder they didn't kill me, really, because I really walked their dog. And I wasn't afraid of them. I constantly challenged them because I wanted to know more. They were somewhat exasperating to work with because they never gave me anything unless I earned it, you know. And their demeanor towards me was basically like we would treat a dog or a cat. You know, they tolerated me. And but when I made a mark and deserved credit, they gave it to me. Now, what I want to do is go back to something that happened, which goes along with your question. I had asked them how they traveled extraterrestrially. So they came to me in my apartment in Phoenix. I was living in Phoenix at the time one night and said, okay, we want to give you your answer. Sit down. So I sat down. Said, take a piece of paper. I did, a pencil. They said, now, I want you to draw a circle. I couldn't understand what this had to do with traveling extraterrestrially, but I did as I was bade. And I drew a circle, and they said, now draw another circle and overlap it by 50%. And I did. And they said, now put a dot in the center of that. And I did. They said, now that's how we travel extraterrestrially. I was furious. I said, what are you doing, playing games with me, you know? And so I berated them to no small degree, you know. And their message to me, figure it out. Let's see if you can do it. It took me a long time, and I had to wrestle with it. But finally one day I did get it. And it was so simple. And this thing began to make sense to me. This became negative. This became positive. Because we're working now, from their point of view and me, we're working in a world of polarities. So this was the negative aspect. This was the positive aspect. This is the balanced middle or the neutral area where the two overlap, you see. It's neither positive or negative and what have you, so it's neutral. So I realized that, and so what I did then was to remove the polarities, and so there was no more negative, and I removed the positive, so there's no more positive. Now I had a simple vehicle to work with. I had this. Now if you take that and you turn it on its side, you see, which I did, we come up with something that looks spherical and much like a spacecraft, don't we? Now I have the dot here, you see. My mind was racing 1,000,000 miles an hour, you know, to put all this together and figure out what they mean. Finally, I came to the point of realization that if I was to remove this and this, I would have the secret to how they travel extraterrestrially. Now keep bearing in mind these schematics I've given you, because this is how they do travel extraterrestrially. This dot that they told me to put in the center represents the mind. The other is the hardware that in a sense surrounds the mind that we see initially in the spherical shape of a UFO. Within the proximity and within the environment of the third dimension, in other words, in our planes of existence, they have to use a vehicle to protect and inure the mind. And so they surround it with energy, which of course is not real energy hardware as we know it, but it is a spacecraft, you see. They remove the limitations of the negative and the positive. They end up with the spacecraft, but the minute that they leave our gravitational field and get out into space, they no longer need the vehicle. They become one with God, their mind, their soul, their heart, and what have you. So that all of this, of course, that was before is now removed, and they are traveling solely with their mind or with spirit. And let's say that their planet is over here someplace. What they do, they contact that synergy on their planet. In other words, their energy and this energy is synergy. And they lock into it with their mind, and they travel through space. They erase all limitations of the speed of sound, the speed of light, and what have you, and they do it with mind. And they do it with spirit. And in truth, most of the planets, of course, are very spiritually oriented, and they revel and talk about the Creator at great length. So true travel extraterrestrially is with mind and soul as opposed to hardware and the way we think it's done. This is why I don't worry too much about some of these lower beings who are amongst us who are still using spacecraft. The guardian forces, of course, use this methodology to travel through space and to overcome the obstacles of, you might say, imagination or realization. So I learned a great lesson from them at that point, and someday I should write a book on a full term of the experiences I experienced with both of these communities when I went in and visited them, because they were very, very interesting. There was another aspect of your question which I think I missed. What was it?
In terms of dimensionality.
Dimensionality. Okay, and what I'm saying is they overcome dimensions through being one with the Creator source itself. There are no levels of consciousness or dimensions at that point. They use that synergy, the energy of their own planet, the energy of God, to move from point A to point B. And they do it, or they'll do it in a matter of, say, if it's way, way out there, trillions of light years away, they'll do it in a matter of hours, you know. In my book back here, the Armstrong Report, page 83, I think it is, I talk about an incident about the United States and having our own UFO in 1961. It was reported in 1961, wherein we took off from Stead Air Force Base. We passed the moon and were well on our ways to Mars in an hour and a half. The speed of that craft at that time, would you believe, was over 300,000 miles an hour. That's a piece of hardware we had right here in our own United States. Of course, that was an accumulation. That knowledge to get to that point of realization, of course, was based upon what we've been given extraterrestrially, was based upon the Nazi information, some of which I have over there or someplace. I don't know what I did with it. Oh, there, here. So anyhow, that's 1961, and that was the exposure in 1961. But we had, as late as the early 50s, late 40s, we were already well into this, you see. 1948, you know, we took information from that group too. Yes?
Is that the anti-gravity method?
Yeah, it's an anti-gravity, and using some of the principles, of course, as taught by the, not so much the good ETs, but the malefic ETs, extraterrestrials, the ones that do not have our best interests at heart. What happened was that there was a trade-off between the Truman administration and those extraterrestrials who asked us to work with them at that time. And they said that if we asked them for the secrets to travel extraterrestrially, they said to us, if we give it to you, let us use your people as biological research entities. I'll come back to that in a minute, okay? Let's go back to the original scenario, and we're talking again about the White Sands, New Mexico incident. And we have already learned that there were 5 bodies aboard. We know that they were examined and exhumed in depth. But let's go back to the craft itself. What did it look like? The craft itself ended up being 100 foot in diameter. So what it was then was a large scout craft. That's about the largest they have, you see. But believe it or not, some of the craft, the motherships that fly around, you could put hundreds of those in one of the mother craft, you know. One of the biggest I ever saw was in California, working with that second extraterrestrial group that I did. I saw that craft one night as I was going on to Beale Air Force Base to stay overnight. The craft, when it finally exposed itself to me, was no less than 50 miles long, and I'd say somewhere between 12 and 15 miles high. Now that's one big mother. And it was there in all that immensity. It was, and it's the mother ship, the control ship for the whole West Coast, whether it be Washington, Oregon, California, what have you. It controls that whole region. The extraterrestrial community I went in with later on was one of their communities in the vicinity of Beale Air Force Base. Some very, very nerdy things going on there, which of course were very sophisticated weaponry system. And they were monitoring it through an extraterrestrial community here on Earth at the time. I won't have time to talk about it today, but it is briefly mentioned again in my book back there. Okay, so the craft was 100 foot in diameter, and there was a question, how do we get it back to Wright-Patterson? Because they wanted it back there to examine it leisurely, you see, and it was in the way sitting in the proving grounds of New Mexico, White Sands. So there was two options. One, they could ignore it and bury it on site. That was considered. Or they could take it overland by night and take a matter of months and finally get it back to Wright-Patterson. Well, they chose the second alternative. And without a doubt, if ever I was to pin an accolade upon the American government and pin a star or whatever on them, that would be it. Because that was a monumental job to move that silly thing from New Mexico at night all the way back to Wright-Patterson, Ohio. But that was a monumental feat. But they did it. Now, they did it with some consequence. For instance, what they would do, they had to divert all traffic. They had to take down power lines. They had to use farmlands. Many of the old farmers became rich overnight, you know. And they would tell them, if you'll let us use your farmland and we'll pay you X amount of dollars, you know, and you can retire, but you must keep your mouth shut, you know. And these old farmers, who were mom and dad and apple pie, they did it, and it became history later on. But they successfully moved that silly thing all the way back in about 6 months' time. Now, an interesting aspect, I met a man here, of all places, he's over in Verde Valley, who was a, if you can get this, he was a, what is it, denim? Is that the, what's the old blue jeans they used to sell that was so popular? Was that denim? Yeah. He was a denim salesman, and he was in Colorado at the time, sitting in a hotel that I know called the Antlers Hotel in what name is that, Colorado City? Durango. No, not Durango. It's the just where the Air Force Academy is now. Colorado. What is it? Colorado Springs, right. He was there. And so he was sitting at the bar, leisurely relaxing after a long day, and this young captain came in and sat down next to him and ordered a drink himself. And they had a couple of drinks, and captain said to him, he said, do you believe in extraterrestrial beings and objects and things like that? So the guy I'm talking about said, yes, I do. He says, I've always believed in it. He says, so do I. So the conversation went on, a couple more drinks, and then this young man unloaded on him that he had in his possession at that time as responsible for the moving of an object, extraterrestrial nature, a spacecraft, if you will, the same one I'm talking about now. He was moving that thing, and he said the most unusual thing happened. Now here's something that's really important to point out, that all spacecraft are not hardware or materialistic. Ours are. So are the Soviets, now the Russians and others, South Africa and others who have craft. They are of so-called sum and substance. But extraterrestrial craft are not hardware, and they are not materialistic. They are mind. M-I-N-D. They can take on the form and the shape of materiality or hardware, but indeed they are not. In this incident that they were talking about, the young man underestimated the height of a bridge, and he had this craft on a lowboy. And in going under this object, I think it was a bridge, anyhow, it didn't fit, and the whole top caved in. Now, you can imagine how he felt as a young captain. That was court-martial for sure. And he was panicked. What happened was they had to pull off the road before daybreak, and they pulled into a wooded area, and they went to sleep. When they woke up, that craft was totally intact. There wasn't a dent, a mar, or burnish or anything on it. It was perfectly in a normal state once again. It had healed itself, or something had healed it overnight. And, of course, the indications were, and this is why he was probing, he said to this man that I'm referring to, he says, I suspect that it has a biological intelligence, and that we think that it actually healed itself overnight. Well, he was right on, because many of the spacecraft that we see have biological intelligence. They're not real. They take on the form and shape of hardware to interface with us in a form and shape which we can accept and believe. But they are something else. They are mind, M-I-N-D. Now, there was an interesting thing about that craft before it left the site. How do we get it back to Wright-Patterson? So the object was, well, now, let me tell you this. In 1948, the largest craft we had would go about from here to the wall over there in width. That was a C-54, which was considered then a big craft. You can't put an object 100 foot into something like this. So what was the solution? Well, the solution was to cut it up into segments, label it, and reassemble it once they got it back to Wright-Patterson, you see. So they said, okay, that's what we'll do. Well, they got an acetylene torch, and they tried to cut this silly thing up. Guess what? It didn't work. I mean, they could burn all day, and it wouldn't budge one iota. Later on, they conducted tests with it. With a 16-pound sledgehammer, they would hit it just as hard as they could, and the 16-inch sledgehammer would bounce off like it was nothing, you know. Nor would it burnish, nor would it mar, nor would it scar, nor would it dent. Resilient, totally resilient. Then they put 10 200-pound men on the surface of it and had them jump up and down in one place to see if they could bend it and dent it. Wouldn't do it. The surface of that craft later on turned out to be less, again, like the flight suits those little guys were wearing, turned out to be less than the thickness of a common everyday newspaper page. And yet it was impervious to being cut and what have you. Now, I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I know they got it back to Wright-Patterson, and it's still there someplace in a hangar, particularly constructed for it, as they have others, and it's still under observation. We learned a great deal, of course, from that particular craft. The United States, of course, is without a doubt the foremost authority when it comes to the Earth itself, into their awareness, technologically, of course, of what we would call a spacecraft. We had our last capture, the last one I was aware of and really in on, and I try to stay abreast of these things. I lecture internationally on these things, you know. I have 2 conferences this year. I have one in Iceland. That's going to be a real interesting one because they're having everyday broad daylight activity in Iceland. And they're coming in and out of a particular iceberg up there, and they promised to take us in after the convention. There's 10 speakers from all over the world appearing there, and I happen to be fortunate enough to be one of them. And I got another big UFO conference, which I'll be speaking at in Tromsø, Norway this year. So I tried to, you know, since I speak at these large affairs and so forth, I keep my ears glued to the ground. I talk to my contemporaries and so forth and find out what the latest is in terms of the state of the art. Much of it, though, I have an advantage over them. I can intuit things, and I can come up with information they don't have. Even the government can't hide things from me because I can plug in and I know what they're doing. Much of it I don't talk about, and I think it's needless to talk about it. And it's really none of my business, nor is it any of your business at this point. Your business is to walk with love and light and with God, and as I said, the rest will take care of itself. Yes?
What's the purpose
Because we are in a different frame of reference than other people are, you know. We have to experience it physically. We're in the third dimension.
We do, but if
Yeah.
they want to take us, they can just do it with mind control.
Well, they do it with mind control. For instance, you're being interfaced with every day in your dream states, and of course in your state of physicality, you're being interacted with by them. They do it through the forms of abductions, they do it through contactees, they do it through mind in many other ways. The one thing that they will not interfere with, I'm talking about now the guardian or good forces, is your free will. It's the most sacred thing there is in all God's universe, and they're not about to interfere with that. They will subliminally influence you, hopefully, to respond in a given manner. And as I spoke later on, using different instrumentation, now you, the ultimate instrument they're using now to influence what is to happen upon the planet.
Do they use the material spaceship as a fear tactic?
Do they use what?
The spaceship as a fear tactic? If we
It's a
see it,
fear tactic?
that we will fear them?
No, that's not their intention. Their intention is, of course, to call our attention to the fact that they're there, you know. And they've always been there. What's happening at this point is that as we raise our consciousness, they've always been there before. We just haven't noted them. Yeah, the good ones and the bad ones. We're beginning to perceive them. There's a big question when you see a craft. Who does it belong to? Does it belong to the government? Does it belong to the good or guardian forces? Or does it belong to the baddies, you say? You have to use a great deal of discretion and discrimination to get involved with these, you know. Now, the ultimate that you use, if you wish to identify one of them, is right here. If this says, ugh, I don't like them, you better believe it, and you better get out of there, because this never lies, this does. You know, you get into intelligence many times makes us fools. If this speaks, though, the subconscious or the intuitive, or anything down here in the solar plexus, and incidentally, right here, as well as up here, you have gray matter. And that gray matter is about the size, maybe a little bit smaller than a baseball. In here is stored everything that you have ever done, the remembrances of it. And I see Joshua shaking his head over here. And it's a little known, of course, medical fact. Many of them know it, but they don't tell you and I. When that resonates and says, you better get out of there, you better listen to it and do it. If it says, oh, it feels so good, and I think I like it, it's telling you the truth, you know. So follow that, and you can never go wrong in terms of identification of these objects that you come into that are extraterrestrial in nature. Yes?
Talking about these beings being of mind, they travel with your mind. Now, when they get to this earth plane, do they then materialize in some material form so we recognize them?
Yes, material.
What about these dead ones? Were they still materializing in
They went
form
through.
even though they were dead?
Yeah, they were interesting enough when they were on our level of consciousness and environment. They went through the same rigors of death that we do. In other words, there was decomposition. The picture that is most common throughout the world right now. Huh?
Even though they went through the whole physical.
Well, the essence, spirit, and what have you was withdrawn from that body, and the body became basically corporeal in nature because at that time they were in a state of corporeality and consciousness, so they were subject to the laws of our planet, you know.
Okay,
and
so why couldn't they, if they were mind, why couldn't they create a body that had all of the eyes and ears?
well, they originally had that. Maybe you lost me. I said they went from that into what they are today. Now, there's another interesting aspect to all this, and I discovered, I guess I have to tell you the story. Some years ago, there's a man by the name of Frank Barankowski. He's in Phoenix. And I don't know why. Frank is always setting me up. He doesn't like me. And so he periodically is having me come down to Phoenix, and I would talk to large groups that he had put together. And his obvious intent was always to discredit me. And this is nothing unusual because I have this, you know, I did for a long time. Anymore I don't. I'm accepted as an authority on the subject, and I don't receive contentious behavior anymore. I wouldn't care if I did. You know, I know who I am, and I know my truth, and I will stick to my the responsibilities and the understandings I have. But in this case, Frank called me down, and I talked for some time. And he said, may I interrupt? And I said, yes, sure. He said, well, he says, I have two people in the audience that I'd like to bring up here to double check that what you're saying. Do I have your permission? This is unheard of. But what could I say? If I'm an authority and I know what I'm talking about, why should I fear somebody else? So I said, yes, bring them up to the stage, and they did. Turned out to be one of the former astronauts, Brian O'Leary, and the local head of the UFO chapter in Phoenix. Both of them called up to the stage. So I began to talk, and Brian O'Leary finally was the one who stood up and he says, look, I don't know what the hell we're doing up here, but this man knows what he's talking about, and I'm not going to waste his time or mine staying up here. Listen to this. Let him alone. So they went down off the stage and left, and I thought it was over. And so I get well into it again. I'm just getting into swing, and Frank says, well, I've got something else I'd like to bring up here. May I do that? And, well, so what are you going to say? You know, no? Are you going to say, well, bring him along? So I said, all right, bring him up. Turned out to be an abductee, a man who was a retired aeronautical engineer and his wife. He was abducted in broad daylight in a parking lot of a shopping mall in the presence and sight of his wife. Was taken out and was gone for hours. And finally, of course, he was reintroduced back into Earth in an altered state. So the object then that I was to debrief this man in front of the whole audience, which I did, you know. And I began to deal with him. And all the time that I'm working with him, he's crying. Oh my God, he cried over and over again. The abuse that he went through and the experiences of it all was traumatic. And he couldn't just carry on a normal conversation. It was difficult for him to do. I remember specifically after I had interrogated him to a very deep depth and so forth, and we'd gotten a lot of information out of him, I said to him, because I was concerned, I said, Frank, or whatever his name was, let's say Frank, would you allow somebody here on Earth to do to you what they did to you on that ship? And he said, certainly not. I said, then how can you condone what they did to you upon the craft? I don't know, but I just don't feel they know what they're doing, or if they do, then of course it's for my best interest and good. And I said to him, well, how can you make this differential, you know? You allow one to do it, and you say you won't allow it here on Earth. And he says, well, I just don't know. Well, at that point, he began to cry very deeply and upset, and I had to wait till he got control again. And so I began to ease out of this whole thing because it was getting too traumatic. But we got to the very end, and I said, Frank, I said, is there anything that you haven't covered that you think would be of prime interest to the people here today? I want you to think for a moment of one thing that you could possibly bring forth. And he thought for a while, and he said, yes, there was. There is something I'd like to say. And I said, good. He said, while they had me on the table in this abduction state, and while they were examining me, just before they started, a human being walked in. I said, do you mean like us, a human being? He said, yes, like us. I said, describe him. He said he was about a little under 6 foot, I would judge. He had brown hair and blue eyes, fair complected. Get this, he was wearing a B-15 flight jacket. And he was obviously somebody of note, because when he walked in, all the Greys almost snapped to attention, you know, and stood back so he could look at Frank on the table. And he went over and he looked down at Frank, you know, and nodded his head to the Greys, and, well, it looks pretty good to me. And he turned around, and at the foot of the bed that they had Frank lying on the floor was a valve of some kind. He didn't know what it was for. But this individual, this humanoid, actually reached down and adjusted that valve, and then he rose up again, he looked at Frank, he smiled at the Greys, and he left. Now, I always suspected that behind the Greys there was another force. And I always suspected that it was humanoid in nature. Not to say that it's human like us, that it has emotions, it's capable of love, or all the things that we are, but it's human looking like. And sure enough, he corroborated that day, that the Greys, their masters, are actually human-like. Now, maybe they're hybrids that they have been successful in creating, you know. Or, here's a thought. Maybe we have in our own government or world government those who now have reached the state that they can master these extraterrestrials such as the Zeta Reticuli types. And that indeed we are the superior ones and they're working for us rather than us working for them. Sort of a mind-boggling possibility. And it certainly is there. And I don't pursue it any further than that, but I throw it open to you as a possible option to think about. Certainly one of the two. It was a hybrid human who looked very much like us, or it was actually a human who is now working conjointly with the so-called malefic ETs. It's a thought. Okay. What else do I want to cover on that? Well, that's basically it. In other words, the White Sands, New Mexico, that's the basics to it, and that's how I got introduced into, and there is another aspect maybe I should bring in. So my first incident involving UFOs per se was in 1948. Now, it was classified top secret and above, really. You could say above top secret. At the same time, there was a little magazine that had just come out and was brand new called Cornet magazine, a little book that looks about the size of Fate. And they scooped that White Sands, New Mexico incident, and they put it in storybook form and published it in a sensational article in the Cornet magazine. 1 minute it was highly classified, the next minute it was on the newsstands in a presentation that was fairy tale-like. We, as young soldiers, all went out and bought copies of it, took it home to our wives and so forth, and it became the topic of discussion for all of that area, you know. 2 days later, they were told by the government, you either cease and desist and get those things off of the newsstand, every one of them, or we'll bankrupt you. And they did, of course. In the meantime, we all had personal copies of this. A blanket order went out to each and all of us. Anybody who had that, they must turn it in immediately under the threat of court-martial. So I had to, of course, retract my copy, and I did turn it in, but I didn't turn it in without resistance. I said to my commanding officer at that point, I said, why aren't we telling the American people this? Why are we hiding these things? I said, it's already out. They've read it, you know. Why are you trying to cover up? Well, the first response was, it's none of your business. You'll do as you're told. You know, he's a colonel and I'm a captain, and so it was an order. And I still was resistant, and he saw it. And I was bucking him. And he says, all right. He says, I'll tell you why. He said, we do not wish to experience once again an Orson Welles scares such as the one he perpetrated in the invasion from Mars. Well, you know, it made some sense in those days. But the unfortunate part about it was that became catch-22. And from that time on, it was always in the interest of the people not to give them this information because they might panic. And then, of course, as a nation of peoples, we'd be in deep trouble. Well, we know that they've long overdone it. I can assure you, and this is me saying this, that sometime this year, probably in the fall or maybe midsummer, we're going to have mass showings throughout the world. It's going to happen. 1993 is numerologically is a 22-4 master year. And everything in our creation and existence is going to be accentuated. The bad is going to be tougher, the good is going to be greater, because it's a master year. And that also means that phenomenal things are going to happen in our consciousness. And part of those phenomenal things that are going to happen in our consciousness will have to do with UFOs or ETs, and we're going to see it. The government, unless they step forward and begin to level with we the people, they're going to end up with egg on their face. It all began in December of 1991, when over Brussels, Belgium, 60-some-odd craft appeared in broad daylight, and for 24 hours stayed there. And of course, it's common rote and fact that everybody in the Belgian society, including the premier, including the policeman, the soldier, the man on the street, and everybody, every one of them swears to this day that this thing happened You can't dissuade them to change their minds. They all saw it. Yes, sir.
What then would be the relationship between the UFOs and the crop circle?
And the what?
Is there a relation between the UFO and the crop circle that happened?
Oh, there's a message in the crop circle phenomena, and they already have the solution, but again, they're not telling us. The interesting side of that is that when it first appeared, it was poo-pooed, as we all know. It still is to some degree today. But what happened in England is they began to appear on parliamentary land. And what most people don't know is that Parliament owns a lot of real estate, you know. So these things began to appear on parliamentary land, and they had to take a look at it. Finally, they said, well, what we'll do, we'll solve the problem and the mystery. They called in physicists and scientists and other people in the know, and they began an in-depth study on these geometric formations of the crop circles. Now, I got this from Tony Dodd, a good friend of mine, of course, who's in the field of ufology in England. And the bottom line, he gave it to me in confidence. He said the bottom line in the decipherization of all those things, there was one basic message. Get ready, we're coming. Get ready, we're coming. This again is why I say that we will soon have mass expositions of craft. We're going to see it, you know, and they are coming. There are things, incidentally too, they're already appearing in Russia. Not so much here, but they're appearing in broad daylight there. I talked to some of my Soviet contemporaries, and some of the stories they tell me are mind-boggling. One of the latest, when I was in Berlin, and I was talking to some of my Russian friends, is that they are now entering the school system. And they're teaching the children what we call new math and new understandings of science, saying that ours is all kooky, you know. And so what happened is the children are of a like consciousness, regardless of their age, or a like consciousness. They can see the individual who is teaching them, and he writes on the board and teaches them the new math and what have you. Most of the school teachers can't see it. All they can see is the writing on the board, which is rather spooky, you know. And some of the teachers now have gotten to the point where they can actually perceive the individual writing this too, and they're extraterrestrials who are actually teaching the Russian children principles of mathematics and things which, of course, are unusual in nature to ours. So there's and you would say, well, why don't they do it here in the United States? For the life of me, I cannot, for the life of me, understand why the United States is such a laggard when it comes to acknowledgement that they exist and to give us the truth. They don't do it. Russia is totally open to it. Some years ago, 3 years ago, in the Frankfurt conference, which I, again, was a principal speaker, they brought out stories of bitter relationships with the children and ETs and UFOs. And they brought forth the accounts of the children, what they saw and what happened when they were taken aboard the craft. And incidentally, none of them were harmed. And they came back and related the experiences, which were loving in nature, with the craft that they had had interaction with. You might say that Russia, believe it or not, or than the former Soviet Union, is more spiritual than we are. You see, our astrological sign is Cancer. Their astrological sign is Scorpio. And Cancer has a propensity, so to speak, of being big mother, you know, controlling everything, and as we do. And they're very perceptive, they're very intuitive, they're very all things that a Cancerian is. But the Russians have a greater credibility in that they can believe in the phenomena, whereas many times we do not. We're resistant to it, you know, unless we can control it. The Russians are open to it, and they will accommodate it. And I think that's the difference between the two nations. The other thing is, being a Scorpio, the Russians have the ability to perceive spiritual things, but they can't bring it to a final resolution in terms of reality. We as Cancerian, we can, and we do. So this is why we always remain the dominant power in the world, you see, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union or Russia. And I don't think sometimes, I don't think that we do others, including ourselves, credit in terms of extraterrestrial intervention or reality. Okay. Now, what do we want to go from here? What would you like to hear from here? What would be of interest? Getting the Nazis and a few other things? Yeah.
Well, I'd like to touch on your experiences in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
You were over there 3 times. I wonder why. I wonder if there was any UFO activity over there while you were there.
Bundles of it, always. And again, it was beyond top secret. There isn't any war that takes place that there isn't mass showings of UFOs and intervention in a sense. And it turns out that Vietnam was one of the most intense we've ever had. And it's little talked about, but you'll find it in government files, highly classified. Now, what happens is we're not looking at the good ETs primarily, we're looking at the malefic ETs because they want the bodies. For instance, the blood and the enzymes and all the things that they could use for biological research or the creation of a hybrid human and so forth. What a better place to get it than right there in the battlefield, you know. Thumbs up for the first corpse they can get and what have you. And they did it. But they've done it in every war, not just the Vietnamese War. You know, the Second World War was full of it. Exactly. And then speaking of Hitler, there's a very interesting story there, which I should relate, I guess, as I'm jumping from one to the other. In the Second World War, of course, we won it, but we feared in the last months of the war itself that we were going to lose it. Because Hitler kept telling the Allied forces in messages that he had a secret weapon. And we laughed, we didn't believe him. And of course, about that time, he was firing the V-2 rockets into England, you see. They were so inaccurate. They weren't hitting targets. They was sort of to whom it may concern. And inadvertently, they wiped out large amounts of cities and peoples and so forth. If their target was a city the size of London, they might hit it, you know. And so the Allied forces, of course, laughed when he said he had a secret weapon because they assumed it was the V-2 rocket. What we didn't know is that they had a state-of-the-art, and more and more of these documents are now being placed in my hands. This was handed to me at a Skywatch. This dates back to 1939, when a man by the name of Professor Phillips had already created a spacecraft wherein he had been to the moon and Mars and Venus and other places. So that when Hitler came into vogue and power and so forth, they wanted this man to work with them. And he says, no way. Obviously, they got some of these technology, but most of what he received, or they received, I should say, was from the malefic ETs. They came into the Second World War through Hitler and the Third Reich. And just as they did with the United States government, they approached him and said, look, I'll tell you what, I will give you the technology and the weapons to win this war if you let me use your people as biological research entities. Well, Hitler, you know, was a nut when it came to Aryan energy. And I have to say this for him, he said, the German people are pure. I will not let you use them, but you can help yourself to everybody I have in prison. Auschwitz and all the others. The Jews, the Poles, the Russians, and all those who were in there in captivity, he said, carte blanche, go help yourself. Now, there's an interesting aside there. Allegedly, 6 million people disappeared from those prison camps. What's not known is at the end of the war, an investigatory commission was commissioned to go in there and actually examine the remains, which was in the form of ashes, of those who had been incinerated or lost. They came up with the possibility of 600,000 as opposed to 6 million. Now that's a far cry from 6 million. And the question is, what happened to the other 5.4 million people? I just told you what happened to them. Hitler made a pact with the Greys, with these malefic ETs, and those people went to them for biological research entity or spare parts, if you will. The ones who were truly incinerated, the ashes were there, and it was 600,000. I come down on the German people all the time and said, how long are you going to carry this unnecessary cross? The young people today, I said, damn it, you didn't do it. Your grandfather did it, your father did it, what have you, but it's not your guilt. You must not take on the blame anymore. You must stop paying reparations. Now get this, paying reparations to Israel. Germany annually is still paying reparations to Israel for what they did in the Second World War. It's unconscionable, you know. And so I raise Cain about it and tell these young people in Germany that you have to divest yourself of this guilt. It's not your guilt, you know. So, but to go back now to our story. Incidentally, that came out, I was being interviewed by the National Finnish TV in Munich. I think it was, what, 2 years ago when I was lecturing there. And they approached me and wanted to interview me and put me on the Finnish National TV, which I did appear on. And they asked the question about Hitler and the prison camps and the ETs, was there any connection? And out of my mouth came this statement. Again, as I said earlier, sometimes something comes out of my mouth. I have no idea that it's going to be said. And when I say it, I said, where did that come from? That's exactly what happened that time. And boy, I'll tell you what, it sent a rocket around the world when I said that, and opened up a lot of inquiries about what actually happened to the 6 million people. And as I said, the only explanation is that that 5.4 million went to the extraterrestrials. Now let's go back to the scenario of the offer that they made to Hitler. Hitler said, no, you cannot use my people, but you can use the people in prison. For that, they said, we will give you the technology to win the war. Now, this was found out by an American intelligence agent. He stumbled on it in a document, a captured document. And in the document, it said that Hitler already had a prototype up and going that was like an extraterrestrial craft. It was a spacecraft that was capable of 1,250 miles an hour. It was capable of vertical takeoff. It was capable of instantaneous 90-degree turns. Now, you're speaking of an ET craft when you speak of something like this. Now, that was a prototype. He had another one on the drawing board, soon to come off. In fact, it came off before the end of the war came. That was capable of doing twice that. It was capable of doing 2,500 and some miles an hour. It was capable of vertical takeoff, 90-degree turns, plus it had a laser weapon aboard that was capable of penetrating 2 to 3 inches of armor. Now, there wasn't a tank that we had that wasn't susceptible then to that type of energy. They could have knocked out every tank we had. They can knock out our battleships and everything else, because that laser weapon would puncture any and all of it. Now, this is the point that the Allied powers become increasingly scared, you know, and they had to be, because they came to the realization that indeed he did have a secret weapon, and if he ever got it up and going, after all the millions of dollars we had spent, thousands upon hundreds of thousands of people we had lost in the war, we're going to lose it. So the decision was made at that time to bring this guy at all costs to his knees. And this is what we saw in the bombardment. And I see it today when I'm over there. The remnants, the Germans have kept some of these as institutions and monuments of the Second World War. You can see all the devastation, particularly in Berlin. And so we decided at that time that we had to pull all stops and stop him at all costs. This is why the mass bombings took place. We bombed these airfields, we bombed these railroads, we bombed these factories, the oil fields, Ploesti oil field, and anything that was sustaining to his economy or to his industry had to be destroyed. Ball bearing factories and all this. Later, I had the privilege as a photo interpretation analyst in Anacostia Naval Base to study these photographs. The devastation that we committed upon them was just catastrophic, really. Now, the point was that we were successful in doing this and causing him to capitulate. And if we hadn't done that, Hitler would have won the war. The Third Reich would have won the war within given 2 months' time more, 2 additional months, he would have won the war. As it was, just as immediately as we won that war, there was a mass push to get into Berlin, number one, to get these 2 craft which he had created. And number two, to get the personnel who were responsible for the building of it. The Allied forces, of course, consisted of the Russians, then the Soviet Union, the Americans, and the British, and then some of the other subsidiary forces. The three major forces, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain, all made end runs for Berlin in hopes of getting there first and capturing the documents and the personnel that were responsible for building this craft. As it was, through our own dalliance and ineptness and so forth, the Soviets got there first, and they got most of the documents. But we got there secondly, and we got most of the personnel and what was remaining of the documents, which turned out to be very apropos to what we needed. That's where the American space program started. What we know today as NASA was originally manned by those scientists and physicists that we actually captured during that Berlin excursion, you see. And that was also, this is phenomenal to believe, but it was also the beginning of what we know today as the CIA. That was headed up by German officers in the very beginning. Yes?
Is that the reason why the Russians beat us in the space program when they launched Sputnik in 1957?
Yeah, they were on the moon before we were. And it was through that technology that they got, of course, from the Germans at that time. I think we could have been there almost concomitantly with them, but we were a little bit, we didn't have the resources that they did, so they managed to get there a little before we did. But the other thing, though, you have to remember this, too, that behind the scenes, the United States and the Soviet Union, now Russia, were never enemies. They were working on getting to the moon conjointly, and whoever could get there first was okay with one or the other, you see. There was no hostility. The moon, of course, there's a book right here, which is a most interesting book. It's long out of print, but it's called Alternative 3. Anybody ever read it? Phenomenal book. It's in my library. I just brought it today to show you. And the object to getting to the moon was based upon this book. The Earth is dying. The Earth is expected by the year 2000, unless we can do something about the ozone layer and what have you, to become defunct, you know. Because through our avarice and greed and our shall we say, inability to deal with things in balance, particularly our ecology, we are facing devastation through environmental factors. That was long recognized back in the 40s and the 50s. And the object was, what do we do in case of? Three alternatives, of course, were presented. One of them was, of course, to leave the planet and find another planet that we could go to in the event this one was destroyed. The other one was to go deep into our own planet underground, subterraneanly, and set up societies and cities and so forth under the ground. And the third, of course, was to exist as we are and face a demise later on. So we had the three alternatives. What we did ultimately as a priority, we accepted and adopted alternative 3, which was going to the moon, another planet. I put them in reverse order, 1 and so forth, but that was the number 1 priority. The second priority was to go underground with underground facilities such as we have out here. And in the event of nuclear attack and in the event of the catastrophic conditions of the deterioration of the ozone layer, we could survive underground. Now, both of these options are in full commitment at this point. We are on the moon. We have been on the moon since the late 40s and early 50s. My tape's back there. I think if you want something very interesting and mind-blowing in a sense, get the tape back there, what NASA didn't tell us about the moon when I talk about this. The other thing in terms of, where do I want to go with that? Well, you had a question. Maybe that was it. Go ahead.
I was just wondering about, we pretty well labeled the moon as far as real estate. How do the Russians feel about that?
The moon itself, as you will hear me say in the tape back there, is not a piece of, although it's a real estate in the consideration of, say, the Soviet Union or Russia and ourselves, it's a place of escape in the event that we can no longer habitate planet Earth. That's the express purpose of it. But what they're not telling you is that the moon, number 1, is the spacecraft. The moon itself was actually flown into the proximity of where it is right now and serves a very, very explicit purpose. It is controlled by extraterrestrials. The group that I work with in the Wickenburg area for 2 years or better told me, I got all this information in the 70s that later came out in the 90s, that the moon, number one, is hollow. Number two, there are 3 extraterrestrial civilizations that live within the moon. And number 3, they are using it for their own purposes, you know, in terms of us and I suppose other things within the solar system. What they didn't tell you, what NASA didn't tell you, and again it's in that book, as they flew around on the dark side of the moon, they discovered that there was vegetation, that there's water, there was lakes and what have you, rivers. And one of the things that was most astronomical in discovery was the fact that there was a huge fan device back there. There was something like a mile across, you know, with giant blades in it. And this silly thing was obviously designed to bring fresh air into the moon itself, you know, to expiate the old air and to exhaust the new air, exhaust the old, bring in the new. They didn't tell you, too, that they had encounters with extraterrestrials while they were on the moon. There was one particular incident, it's right on TV, or you could see it on TV, where the moon buggy was actually bombarded by a craft and they shot off a fender, you know. There were several astronauts, too, 2 of them, one of them is dead and one of them still living, who talked about the extraterrestrial experiences they had on the moon. One is Buzz Aldrin, now Admiral Aldrin, retired, who went berserk for a while and they couldn't shut him up, and he revealed many of the things that were classified in terms of military or government secrets about the moon. Finally, they shut him up by saying, if you don't shut up, we're going to take your retirement away, and many other threatening things. And of course, the ultimate would be to eliminate him. A predecessor of his by the name of Roden, of course, was not controllable, and he wouldn't shut up, and he did end up dead. Again, he's mentioned in the book Alternative 3. And so through these men, we learned a lot of what was going on on the moon about the conjoint relationship that the United States and the Soviet Union had at that time on the moon as a piece of real estate. And the design was a place to go in the event that Earth was destroyed by nuclear attack or through the decomposition of the ozone line. Yes, Doris?
Isn't the moon supposed to be, the dark side supposed to be about 2,000 degrees below zero, no atmosphere and all of that?
How could it be if we got vegetation and water and things like that?
That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. No, they've been lying to us. Actually, they don't need all the apparatus that they wear on the surface of the moon either. The surface of the moon has oxygen. It looks very much like this. That second, all the showings that we had was subsequent to actually being on the moon. We were already on the moon years and years and years before we had the first landing that was public in nature.
Sort of stuff you learned when you were a kid in school is all malarkey.
Yeah, yeah, they were lying to us. You see, there's a government and there's a shadow government. The shadow government doesn't tell the government what it's doing. And so all these secret programs were taking place with, and it's interesting to note that much of the funding for these extraterrestrial, not extraterrestrial, but extracurricular activity is coming from drug money, you know. And that's where it's going. It's going into the secret government, along with your taxes, of course. And so we've been on the moon. Now, incidentally, before I close that off, it took the Russians, the Russian Academy of Sciences, a very prestigious body, of course, in the Soviet Union, now Russia. And they were the one, 2 of their scientists and physicists stepped forward and said there's only one explanation for the moon. Number 1, it doesn't belong in our solar system. Number 2, it can only be a spacecraft and was driven into the proximity of the Earth. Well, I'd learned this, number 1, from the Indians, and then I'd learned this from the extraterrestrial group that I worked with in the Wickenburg area back in the 70s. And then to see these scientists in Russia come out with this proclamation, you know, was really enriching and endearing to my heart, because I had been saying it for years in advance of that. Was there a question there?
I was curious as to, your spiritual journey, in the transformation from military life to civilian life,
That happened through the Kundalini. And it's something that I don't fully understand even to this day. My Kundalini came up, and of course it changed me from what I was into what I am. And it almost killed me. It came up the wrong way. I knew there was no such thing as Kundalini. I didn't know about it, you know. I didn't know what was happening to me. I was a successful businessman on the East Coast, Tampa, Florida, when this actually took place. And I had a very difficult time dealing with it because the reality that I knew was totally changed overnight. All of a sudden, I had the ability to see auras around people. I called it light then. I could read their minds. I could astral travel. I could do all these things. And I have to tell you, it was very spooky for me. Okay, as I always do before I start again, any questions on any of the segments? Yeah, all right. Yeah.
The two prototypes, German prototypes that could go 1,000 and over 2,000 miles an hour, etc. What happened to those prototypes?
Okay, that's an interesting story, and I guess I should tell that because it's part of the Second World War scenario. Let's go back to where I left off with that number 2, that the Russians and the Americans got most of it, and they began to work conjointly. And the question was, what happened to the 2 craft that, of course, he had up and going? When Hitler saw that indeed he was going to lose the war, and he was convinced, of course, by those around him in the Third Reich, particularly the SS, and that they better bug out of there, that's exactly what they did. They dismantled the 2 craft, they put them aboard 3 submarines, and they escaped just before the Allied powers closed in and took over Germany. And those 3 craft spent 6 months at sea, mostly under, and ended up in Argentina. And Hitler, of course, was let up in Argentina, and as I told you earlier, he lasted out his last days there. The 2 craft, along with elements of the SS, were taken into Antarctica, and a place called, it belongs to Sweden, it did, not anymore, but it's called, it's named after Queen Maud, and the name of the place is Queen Maud's Land. And they went in there and established a base in there, a redoubt area, and set up another SS operation. Now, they did that in concert with the extraterrestrials. They had full access to the state-of-the-art of the extraterrestrial technology. What happened was, some years later, 1945, the war ended in August, we then decided that they were a definite threat to the world, and particularly to the United States, because of what the knowledge they had and the technology they had and so forth. I'm sorry, dear. You're a good sneaker, I'll say that. It was decided by the Allied powers in general, and particularly the United States, that we must go in there and evict them, and we also wanted the spacecraft. We wanted them very, very bad, you know.
United States knew they were there.
Oh, sure they did. Yeah, we knew the whole scenario, and we found it out through our own intelligence later on. So what we did, we had a man who had been into the Hollow Earth, a man of some renown. He was an admiral, Admiral Byrd. And Admiral Byrd had retired, and so what we did, we recommissioned him, called him back to active duty, and commissioned him to go down there and dig out the SS factors in Queen Maud's Land. They gave him 8 months to do it. They gave him unlimited resources in terms of planes and ships and all support resources he needed. At the end of 8 weeks, 2 months, he was totally defeated, Byrd was. Because the Germans in there and the extraterrestrials, the state of technology they had, was so far superior to our own, there was no way that we could hope to take them. Now, this whole thing was being orchestrated and controlled basically by the extraterrestrials. The Nazis, of course, were a part of it. As an example, aircraft would be flying along, you know, in a harmless state and so forth, and finally they'd come up against an invisible barrier and explode and disintegrate. They were using psychotronics to the extent that the overland troops, as they would go in to attack the target, would be subject to psychotronics, and it would drive them crazy, or their heads, even to the point that their heads would explode. I mean, it was hideous what was happening to all of the armed forces down there. And finally, it was Byrd who said, you know, it's inhuman, I can't do it, and we have to say it's impossible. So Byrd then informed the Allied powers that these people were far beyond us in technology and mentality, and that we would have to let them go. Now, they are what I call, we have what I call a Mexican standoff with those peoples at this point in time. First of all, they're in Antarctica, which of course is a large ice mass. And if we were to go in there and drop a bomb on them, nuclear in nature and what have you, we would break all that loose. And ecologically, we would probably flip our axis, you see, because of the disorientation and the weight shift in terms of what we would do with a nuclear attack. At this time, the United States government and some other world powers have reached the same state of the art that, of course, they have. So now we have what we call a Mexican standoff. They're pretty much isolated, doing their own thing, and we're doing our own thing. So it's no longer a threat. The threat, of course, if is to be one, is the subversion of yours and my consciousness. You know, this is why I came in with at the very beginning and tried to impress upon your minds that the only solution to any and all of this is spiritual in nature. If we buy into the very things that I've been telling you, which is just part of a tap dance, you know, I could in 5 minutes I could give you everything you need to know and walk out of here, and you would be just as well off as you were listening to me for 4 hours. So people like entertainment, and of course I'm here to entertain. At the same time, to educate you in terms of what's happening in the world. The bottom line to any and all of the things that I'm telling you is to live your own truth, to walk your own talk, to walk in love and light and balance. And if you do those things, all else will take care of itself. And I always end up with that, and I will again today. Does that answer your question? Okay. And then, of course, the scenario to that was, as I said, Hitler, of course, lived out a normal lifespan and died a natural age. And again, he was an instrument, divine in nature. And if you stop and think about the Second World War, a lot of good things have come out of the Second World War. Certainly, it was to teach us never to war again. There never will be, as you will find out tomorrow. For instance, in the Hopi prophecy and some of the Indian prophecy I'll give you, there is not another major war destined to be. There will not be one. First of all, the powers who overlight us, I didn't say overshadow, but I said overlight us, will not permit a third world war, because this planet cannot be destroyed, because it is an integral, essential part of the graduation ceremony. All of our sister planets and brother planets are waiting for us. We must make it this time at all costs. They will allow us to err, if you will, up to a point. But when it comes to the point it looks like we're going to destroy the planet itself, they will intervene. They will interfere with our free will, because we've gone beyond the free will limitations, you see. Now, in truth, there is no such thing, believe it or not, as free will. We say there is, but there is not. There is free will to a limit. If, and I use this blackboard illustratively, if we stay within the confines of this blackboard, we have free will. But if we stray outside of the confines of this blackboard or whiteboard, we'll get zapped, you know. So, have a question back there? No. Oh, okay. So free will, I'm saying to you, has its limitations. Within our realm and arena of understanding, there is such a thing as free will. But if we go beyond, it's just like the Garden of Eden, you know. As long as Adam and Eve agreed to the original principles and precepts and so forth, there was free will and everything was hunky-dory. But when they violated that, they were kicked out of the garden. And of course, we know what happens historically since then. Okay. Any other questions? Now, okay, we were talking about wormwood, weren't we? We want to talk about that briefly. So let me spend the next 20 minutes, if you will, there's no more questions, I will spend this on more one. Yes?
Or you're going to expound a little bit more on your own personal transformation from your...
Well, there's not much really that I can say about my personal experience. There was a shift in consciousness which came through the arising of my Kundalini. And what I say about that even today, I don't fully understand it. I say facetiously, I say today I is and yesterday I are. You know, I don't know. I don't think anybody fully understands the Kundalini, other than it is an energy which is in all of us, which in due time, sooner or later, will come up in all of us. It's located at the base of the spine. It's in a coiled fashion. In fact, it's called the serpentine energy. It's coiled up like a snake in a very tight ball. And at a given moment or given time, when appropriate, it can be unleashed. And what happens is at that point, it begins to open up like this. And then, of course, it travels up the spine and through the individualistic chakras until, of course, it reaches the crown chakra. And you receive, you might say, the Christ consciousness, which gives you the great awareness and perception. In other words, you're clairvoyant, such as I am, or psychic, call it what you will. You have all the gifts that you once had, you see, and you can use them for the betterment of self and also for the betterment of mankind. There's two ways for the Kundalini to come up. There's a proper way, which of course should be under the direction and guidance of someone who understands it and has had the experience themselves, or it can come up just all of a sudden, and most times that is fatal. Mine was near fatal. And the things that happened to me, I wouldn't wish upon anybody else. One of the attributes that goes with it that is at first very exciting is that you have unlimited sexual prowess, you know. And the fact of the matter is you walk around with a perpetual erection 24 hours a day, and there's no satiating it. Now that sounds like fun. Initially it might be, but I'll tell you what, it becomes a nightmare, particularly when you're a businessman as I was, one who was on call for the whole state of Florida, and I'm going through these energies and in a high state of excitation and what have you. It basically ruined my marriage, for one thing, and caused a lot of other problems. It gave me, when it came up, it scalded me inside. And my intestines were totally scalded. For instance, if I did any food that had substance to it, the linings of my intestines were so soft and flaccid that objects such as nuts and pieces of salad and so forth would actually anchor on the intestines, the inside. Then they would heal over. And then they become ulcerous, and then they would become, what do you call it? Well, poisonous. There's a word for it. I can't think of it. Putrefied is one. Yeah, that's a word for it too, but it's a medical word for it. I can't think of it right now, but nonetheless, it breaks. Then those toxins go into the system, and of course, it poisons the whole system. It's like it'd be equivalent to a appendicitis attack that you know it breaks, and then you're living with it. Then it becomes abnormal, and it could kill you because of the acids and the poisons within it. That's what happened to my stomach, and it was an effort for me to walk, because every step was excruciating. I would actually have tears in my eyes, and I was in constant pain. I fought it. For instance, what I did. I would go out at night after work and I would run. And for the first mile, I cried. I mean, physically cried and anguished and in some cases screamed. As I got into the second mile, I began to relieve it a bit, you know, and I could feel more comfortable with it. And that's actually what I did. I forced myself through it. I ran myself out of it until eventually it got to an acceptable state. But it was a woman who came to visit me in Tampa, Florida, who put me on the spiritual path, a woman by the name of Reverend Peggy York, who was told in Sacramento, California, there was a man to be found on the East Coast, and that she was to go find him, and she was to put him on the path because he had works to do here on the planet. That guy was me. And I had a reading with her, one against my reluctance was terrible with her, but Spirit saw that I finally had a reading with her. And what was supposed to be a 20-minute reading lasted 5.5 hours. And she, all of a sudden, we took a break, and she looked over my head, and she pointed, and she says, they tell me you have a very bad stomach. What happened? And I said, well, my Kundalini came up and did all this and that to me. She says, well, they tell me you're to eat grass. And I laughed. I said, yeah, eat grass like a cow, you mean? She said, no, dummy. You go to the health food store, and you get alfalfa tablets, and start taking those, and they will clean up and heal the intestines. And that's what I did. I went and got alfalfa tablets, and within, I would say, 6 weeks, I'm back on a regular regime of and diet of food and begin to get better. Do you have a question, Michael?
What do we have to do as far as being able to protect ourselves from different entities?
You know, Michael, at this time that we're in, it is a constant thing that you must practice and realize. I protect myself when I get up in the morning. I protect myself when I go to bed at night with my prayers and all things. Any moment that I get into a situation in this life now that is unfavorable to me, I immediately put the light around myself and protect myself. We must do that because the forces of darkness, even though they're a part of us, they are trying to circumvent us and keep us from coming into our natural beingness and state. And it's a good question, because I put this out to you too. I don't care how advanced you are. In fact, sometimes the more advanced you are, the more vulnerable you are. And the more they want to target you to wipe you out, you know. So it's a constant duty and attention thing to keep yourself protected at all times. Yes, thank you, Michael, for asking that question. So in terms, going back to you and the Kundalini, Peggy's the one who told me to go on to eat grass as my Indian. Incidentally, that came from my Indian guides. There were 6 of them standing behind me. And in the initial, I have to tell you the whole story. In the initial presentation, I heard this woman was coming to town in Tampa, Florida, and she was a renowned psychometrist. You know what a psychometrist is? Okay. She was renowned. I mean renowned. She could take any object, put it up to her third eye, and she would give you your life's history. And what happened was, she rented a ballroom in this hotel in Tampa. There were 350 people in there. And she had a stage like this, a set of steps here and a set of steps here, and they would come up to her and cross in front of her, and she'd take an object and put it up to her third eye and give them an instantaneous reading. And boy, they were right on. In one case, a man came up and he took his pen out and he handed it to her. She put up to her third eye and she says, oh, I see you're having an affair with your secretary. And his wife was in the audience. And then something happened to another woman and her spouse was in the audience. She fainted. That woman fainted. And then there was a big secret deal industrially taking place in the Tampa Bay area. And this dummy got up there and gave her his watch, you know, and she says, oh, I see you closed the so-and-so deal. And it was totally secret, but she exposed the whole thing right then and there. But just before that, she had with her as an opening shot what they call a Kundalini healer. Never seen one since, and I don't want to really see one. He could use his hands. He could actually affect the Kundalini of the person sitting in front of him. He would get within the proximity of the person. He would put his hands in the aura of the person. And it's like you see people in hypnosis, you know, he can move them back and forth or bark like a dog or whatever, although he didn't do that. He had the person, though, under his total control. The minute that he touched the aura of the person went like this and was out. And then he could take his hand, and as he would pull away from them, their body would go forward with him. As he pushed, they would go back. He controlled them through the energy field, theirs and his, to do what he wanted. Then I heard some damn fool say, you can't do that to me. And when I looked around to see who it was me. And I was standing up. And I realized that I had said it, and I was standing up, and every head swung to me, and I didn't know what to do. And before I could make a decision, he said, young man, get up here. And I did go up. And so what happened was he tried to do it to me, and he couldn't. Just as I said, he couldn't put me under. But my God, the power that man had in his hands, as he would pull his hands through my aura, I could feel everything. I could feel the blood actually being pulled in his veins, you know, and the energy field that he was pulling on. People later told me that my face was as red as his shirt. It was just beet red, and especially when he brought the energy up around here, you see. So you can imagine what was happening to the rest of my body. What finally happened is he collapsed in exhaustion, and I was totally enervated myself. But he said to me, he said, "You're right, I can't do it to you." Peggy, at that point, the one who put me on the path, she said she knew right then and then that I was the man she was looking for. And then later on, she told me that when that happened, these 6 Indian guides I have were the ones who put me up to it. And they were hilarious because I had stood up and made this so-called mistake. But again, it was that experience, the Kundalini experience, and Peggy York and so forth that put me on the path. And that was in 1971 or somewhere around there. So I have to say to you and everybody in here, I did not get here willingly. I got here kicking and screaming. I really did. And to me, it was a bunch of hooey, being an old retired military man, a government man, a businessman, and all that. I fought it all the way. I was not about to be seduced into this whole affair, but gradually I was, and of course, thank God today that I did finally listen and take it to myself, and of course, it's been my life ever since. Okay, now let's quickly, yes, dear.
Virgil, I know that it's getting toward the end of the day. I would love to hear you talk more about how we can protect ourselves from abductions and from some of the stuff that's going on, you know, wherever we are. Is there a ritual or is there something specific that we need to be aware of that will help us be protected?
Well, the simplest thing is, as I said, to cover yourself with the light. Be one with God. And if you are one with God, and you can visualize the light around yourself, or love, or whatever, then you're not vulnerable.
You said that talking about a talk about this lady that there were 3 things that you had decided when they came towards you, if the Greys tried to come abduct you, that would make them go away from you?
Yes, I can give you that. That's it's an affirmation which you make, which protects you from being abducted, or in the process of being abducted, you can stop them from doing these terrible things to you. It's 3 basic things, and I don't take credit for this. This comes from a woman who actually experienced this and performed it in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was taken out of her bed, and she was taken aboard this craft, and like all other abductees, they were about to put her on the table and to examine her. And for women, it's much more horrendous than it is for men. You know, the things they do to women is terrible. But just as they began they disrobed her. And at that point, she spoke out, and she came out with the most remarkable thing, in my opinion. And I've used it ever since to help people around the world. She said simply this. She said, "Stop." Right away, "Stop." Now, these were the little Greys she was talking to. "What you're doing is in violation of my free will." I'm putting up here on the board for you. So the first thing, she said, "Stop." Then she said, "What you're doing is against or interfering with my free will." So we'll put just free will. Number 2, she said, "What you're doing is in violation of the Christ principle." Christ principle. 3, she said, "And what you are doing is in violation of universal law." So, universal law. Now, here's the kicker to the whole thing, and really threw them into a panic. Stop, panicked them, and then she said, "If you don't believe so, go ask your masters." There was the clincher. She said all 3 of these things, and she says, "Now, if you don't believe what I said, that this is true, go ask your masters." So then the final thing that you say is, "Go ask your masters." All right, now I already told you that their masters are humanoid in nature. At that point, she threw this courtier of grays into a whole state of excitement and disorder. You know, and so finally it was agreed that 2 of them would peel off and go back to the masters and get an answer to this. 2 of them went into the ship and lost themselves, and after a couple of minutes or maybe 5 minutes or so, they came back. And they said, the master said, she's right, let her go. She had exercised her authority, she had exercised her godship through these commitments that she made here, and she had the intelligence and the perception and foresight enough to know that none of this would amount to anything unless it was to be decreed by the masters. So when the masters realized that she was of the light and she was perceptive enough to know the truth, they said, let her go. And she was taken back into her bed and released and hasn't been harmed since then. Now, I've used this myself on several occasions, and believe me, it will work. So if you want to put it in your memory, free will, Christ principle, and universal law, begin with stop, end it up. If you don't believe so, go ask your masters. And it works.
I've also heard, and I'm sorry I don't remember, that there are 3 sacred names you call out that
Yes.
falls not only in space, not only extraterrestrial, but in form of evil that
Yeah.
you're confronted with.
Well,
I don't remember the name.
you see, there it is. Now that's the point I want to bring out. Why make it complicated? It reminds me of a time that I was attacked by an old sorcerer. You know, I've worked with the Indians now for 23 years. And in my early days, I got into some tough times. And one of them was down here in the Papagos Reservation with a very evil man, a sorcerer by the name of Juan Francisco. And don't ever doubt the powers, I'll be talking about it tomorrow in my Indian presentation, the power of the mind, particularly as applied by the Indians. This old bugger had me before I knew what to do. He was inside of me and he was controlling me. And I was trying to think of all the things I could say to break his energy like you were doing, you know. You know what? I came up against a blank wall. I couldn't think of anything, and I was near a state of panic. And finally, I said, one of my favorite sayings, even before I was about to die in combat or something like that, you know, I've got one favorite thing is, oh, shit, you know. and somehow or other, it breaks the energy. There's something sacred about saying that. I'm not kidding you. Do you know that, for instance, when they recover the little black boxes, that the most common comment on there is, oh, shit? Yeah. So why it is so, I don't know. But when I did that, I broke that energy, that panic state I was in, you know, and I said, you damn fool. I said to myself, you damn fool, all you have to do is cover yourself with the light, with God's light, and the rest will take care of itself. And when I did that, I broke his energy, and he turned around and he smiled at me because he was ignoring me. He was attacking me through it was getting dark, and he was attacking me through the glass of the car, which now was mirror-like. He was getting me through that. And he turned around and grinned at me, acknowledging that I had broken his energy and power, you know. Later on, we really got into a real Donnybrook, you know. And tomorrow I'll talk about it. But the thing I'm trying to say to you and anybody listening to this video or in this audience today, for God's sakes, keep it simple. K-I-S-S. Keep it simple, sunshine, you know. Now, in the military, we didn't say that. We used to say K-I-S-S was keep it simple, stupid. So the more we think of mantras, the more we think of affirmations, the more we complicate things, the less effective we are. If you can just be one with God, that's why I impressed upon you in the very early part of this, to have in your conscience, to be one with God, to walk in love and light and balance, that takes care of it all, you know. You don't have to be a Rosicrucian. You don't have to be a Mason. You don't have to be any of those brotherhoods to be important or to protect yourself in the event of these catastrophes that might happen, you see. So when you come up against something like that, just cover yourself with the light and say, thine will be done. The rest will take care of itself. This is what I do. And I'll tell you, I've been in horrendous situations as a spiritual warrior. Some that you wouldn't believe I walked away from. That was the power I used, you know. Yes?
I'm really curious about what's happened in Sedona and around there.
Well, I don't think this is the time and the place to go into it. I will tell you this much, as I said earlier, there are some things going on which are very uncommon in nature. They are extraterrestrially oriented. They do involve the United States government and militarily and what have you. And these are things that are not only taking place here, but throughout the whole southwest United States. Bill Cooper, in his book, Beware a Pale Horse, and many of the other publications that are out, they deal with this phenomena in depth, and all of it is gloom doom. Some of it is reality, as I said. And it is a reality only so far as that which we have created for ourselves. All of this, Dulce, Groom 51, Sedona, or any other area that has this very aberrant energy, in other words, our involvement with the bad ETs, all of that is illusionary. The only real truth, the only real thing that you have to hang on to is that divine spark within you and love. And if you can believe in that and let the rest of this stuff take care of itself, then you will be safe in the future in terms of what is about to happen to any and all of us. If you buy into the fear, if you buy into the control, and let these things affect you and take your power away, you're going to be one of them rather than one of the incoming consciousness. So I say to you, be aware that these things are happening, but don't get involved in them. Don't give them your power, because that's what so many are doing. It's just like the earth changes. We're giving our power away. It's like these scary things we hear about the government and Dulce and Groom 51, where we know that we're actually committed to working with the extraterrestrials, biological research, and many other hideous things which are going on, 7 different levels that are involved. If we do that and we dwell there, then again we lose our power. Responsible for your journey here on earth. None other. God loves you. God doesn't care whether you sit on that chair or you sit on the floor. God doesn't care whether you're rich or you're poor. Makes no difference to him. The only thing that the source, the creator, what matters to him is you don't forget her or him or it, the creator. All else is illusion. All else is fun and games. All else was created for you experientially to grow, to experience these things, solve the riddle of the moment, rise above it, and go on to the next level of consciousness. And that's what it's all about. And there's many in this audience, if not all of you right now, who are reaching for that ultimate final step before you cross over from the 3rd dimension into the 4th and the 5th. Only you know where you are. If you can take to heart some of the simple things I said today, you are assured to be part of the graduation ceremony. There's a tape back there called the Cosmic Express. It's the most popular tape I have. I cut it, I think, in 1979 or 1980. And that little thing is profound. And I don't know, back in those days, it was too complicated for people to comprehend. Today, the consciousness level, of course, is much higher. Now, 12 years later, and people are beginning to understand it or can understand it. And it's become a very popular tape.